The Complete History of Heroin, the miracle drug that deceived the world. Good evening. Tonight we move into the rougher, less certain, and far less celebrated side of medicine. Set aside the cinematic images of broken artists and dim street corners. This narrative does not open in darkness, but inside the bright, polished laboratories of the most trusted pharmaceutical corporations on the planet. The reality is that when its promise was first revealed, you, just like millions of others, would have described it as nothing short of a miracle. So, before you settle in completely, take a brief moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the work I share here. And please, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. It's always intriguing to see how many corners of the world gather here together. Now, lower the lights, get comfortable, and let's walk into tonight's journey side by side. Before there was a molecule or a label or a syringe, there was a flower. It was a deceptively modest thing. Papaver somniferum, the sleep-bearing poppy. It rises only a few feet from the ground, its stalk coated in a pale waxy green, almost bluish, when seen through the shimmer of a summer afternoon. At its peak rests the bloom itself, a fragile bowl of petals, sometimes white, sometimes softly pink, sometimes a deep bruised purple. They are as thin as parchment, trembling at the slightest breath of wind. Yet the petals are not the true prize. Once they fall away, they leave behind the pod a small crown sphere, a swollen seed head, heavy with the promise of new life, and something else entirely. Within this rounded globe runs a web of fine channels carrying a milky white latex, a bitter sap. For thousands of years, this substance marked humanity's most profound and intimate bond with a plant. The story begins here, in this sap. It begins in the rich, yielding soil between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. In the slow unfolding dawn of civilization, the Sumerians tended vast fields of these nodding flowers. They understood the secret hidden in the pod. Using a small, sharp blade, they made shallow, deliberate cuts in its skin. Almost at once, the white milk began to seep out, gathering on the surface like tears. Left beneath the sun, it thickened and darkened, transforming into a sticky, brownish gum. This was opium raw and untouched. They gave the plant a name that revealed everything about their relationship with it. They called it Hulgil, the joy plant. They pressed it into tablets and used it to treat countless ailments, from relentless coughs to the severe, gut-twisting agony of dysentery. But its greatest gift was forgetfulness, a gentle, painless drifting into sleep, far from the hardships of a harsh and unforgiving world. The knowledge of the joy plant was treasured as a kind of sacred technology passed from healer to healer. From Mesopotamia, this knowledge began to spread. It traveled with caravans, small dark bricks of comfort, tucked into saddlebags, exchanged for copper timber and textiles. It reached the great empires along the Nile. In Egypt, the poppy gained devoted followers. Physicians who were also priests administered opium with a reverence usually reserved for the gods themselves. The Ebers Papyrus. Among the oldest medical texts known, dating to around 1550 BC, lists remedies that included opium. It was given to calm crying children, a practice that would echo with grim consequences thousands of years later. It also played a role in complex religious ceremonies, serving as a key to unlock the doorways of the mind. The poppy was so deeply woven into Egyptian culture that it was buried alongside pharaohs, a final comfort for their journey into the afterlife. Trade routes expanded further. Phoenician sailors, the master traders of the ancient world, carried opium across the Mediterranean in their ships. They delivered it to Carthage, to Spain, and most importantly, to Greece. Here at the heart of Western thought, opium was more than a medicine. It became part of mythology and philosophy itself. The Greeks associated the poppy with deities of sleep and dreams, such as Hypnos and Morpheus. It was also linked to Thanatos, the god of death, an acknowledgement of its dual nature. It could offer gentle rest, but in excess it could bring a sleep from which there was no return. They understood how narrow that boundary was. Hippocrates, often called the father of medicine, rejected mystical explanations for illness. Yet he did not reject opium. He recognized its value as a pain reliever and as a styptic to halt bleeding. By systematizing its use, he granted it a new kind of scientific legitimacy. By the time the Roman Empire rose to dominate the known world, opium had become perhaps the most common and effective drug available to physicians. Rome itself consumed vast quantities. The legions marched with it. Military doctors relied on it to treat battlefield wounds. In the crowded streets of the city, vendors sold it alongside bread and wine. The most renowned physician of the Roman age, Galen of Pergamon, was an ardent supporter. He regarded opium as nearly universal in its healing power, prescribing it for headaches, epilepsy, snake bites, and deep melancholy. He famously included it in his celebrated cure-all theriac, a complex blend of dozens of ingredients that stood as the gold standard of Roman medicine. Galen's writings would be preserved and studied for the next 1500 years, and with them the unquestioned reputation of opium. Quite simply, it was seen as the mother of all medicines. For centuries, this was the reality. The dark gum of the poppy remained a constant presence, a dependable companion in a world filled with pain. Its power was undeniable, yet it was also unpredictable. The strength of one batch of opium could differ greatly from another, shaped by soil climate and the moment of harvest. A dose that eased suffering one day could prove deadly the next. It was an immensely powerful yet unsophisticated tool. Medicine at that time was closer to an art than a true science, and the use of opium stood as its most extreme and perilous expression. But the world itself was shifting. The era of alchemy was slowly fading, making room for the emerging age of chemistry. Beneath the wavering gaslight of the early 19th century, a new kind of thinker began posing a new kind of question. Knowing that opium worked was no longer enough. They wanted to understand why it worked. They sought to take apart the joy plant piece by piece to uncover the mechanism behind its strength. They aimed to extract its very essence. And in a small, quiet town in Germany, a young and driven pharmacy apprentice was on the verge of doing exactly that. He would give that essence a name, and through that act, he would alter the course of medicine forever. The era of the plant was drawing to a close. The era of the molecule was about to dawn. His name was Friedrich Serturner. He was a young man, barely in his 20s, employed as an assistant in a pharmacy in Paderborn, a modest city in Westphalia. He was neither a renowned professor nor a wealthy industrial magnate. He was simply curious, and he possessed a dangerously relentless persistence. Night after night, once the pharmacy shutters were closed and the streets had fallen silent, Saturna labored alone in his humble laboratory. His fixation was opium. He was convinced that the raw, sticky resin was not a single substance, but a mixture of many, and that one specific component, a single active ingredient, was responsible for its remarkable effects. He referred to this theoretical substance as the principium somniferum, the principle that induced sleep, while his goal was to seize it. The process was slow, monotonous, and filled with danger. Using the crude instruments available to early chemistry beakers, flasks and alcohol burners, he launched a systematic chemical attack on raw opium. He dissolved the dark resin in acid, then neutralized the solution with ammonia. This reaction caused a substance to separate out, forming tiny grayish-yellow crystals. He had isolated something, but what exactly was it? To find out, he tested the compound on stray dogs and mice. The results were astonishing. The animals sank into a deep, profound sleep so still it resembled death itself. When they eventually awoke, they appeared unharmed. Saturna was convinced. This, he believed, was the pure core of opium's power. Yet, belief was not enough. To confirm its effects on humans, he needed human subjects. So in 1817, in an act of scientific courage that bordered on recklessness, he enlisted 3 of his friends, all young men close to his own age, and volunteered himself as the first subject. He carefully weighed a dose of the crystals for each of them. It was a minuscule quantity, just half a grain, roughly 30 milligrams. They swallowed the bitter powder. 30 minutes passed. Nothing happened. Saturna, feeling both disappointed and perhaps slightly foolish, chose to double the dose. He administered a full grain to each of them. This time, the effects were unmistakable. Warmth spread through their bodies, followed by a heavy leaden sensation that was both soothing and overwhelming. Their heads grew thick, their thoughts slowed dramatically. Still, Saturna was not satisfied. He pressed on and administered a 3rd dose. This time, the reaction was severe. Nausea, dizziness, and an intense headache took hold. One of his friends collapsed into a stupor so deep he could not be roused. Saturna, suddenly aware that he had gone too far, that he was standing on the brink of poisoning both his friends and himself, had to act quickly. He administered a powerful emetic, a dose of vinegar, to induce vomiting and purge their bodies of the substance. They all survived, weak, disoriented and ill, but alive. The experiment had succeeded. He had done it. He had isolated the first active alkaloid ever extracted from a plant. He named his creation Morphium after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams, a fitting homage to the ancient force he had now concentrated and controlled. Later the name would be standardized as morphine. At first, the discovery attracted little attention. Saturna was an unknown figure from a provincial town, but gradually the significance of his work began to ripple outward through the scientific world. The French chemist Joseph Louis Gay-Lussac recognized the brilliance of the breakthrough. And soon, pharmaceutical firms such as Merck in Germany began producing morphine on a commercial scale. The effect on medicine was nothing short of revolutionary. For the first time, physicians possessed a painkiller of known and consistent purity. They could administer it with accuracy. A dose of morphine meant the same thing in London as it did in Paris or Vienna. It was 10 times more potent than raw opium, a concentrated and dependable weapon against pain. It transformed surgery from a brutal test of endurance into a procedure with real chances of survival. It offered relief to cancer patients, to those suffering from neuralgia, and to anyone trapped in the grip of extreme unbearable pain. It appeared to be a flawless, untainted miracle. But this miracle carried a dark counterpart, and a new piece of technology was poised to release it on a scale the world had never experienced before. In the 1850s, a Scottish physician named Alexander Wood and a French surgeon named Charles Prevost independently developed the hypodermic syringe. It was made up of a hollow needle connected to a plunger. For the first time in medical history, a drug could be injected straight into the bloodstream, avoiding the slow, inefficient passage through the digestive system. The result was immediate and extraordinarily potent. The union of pure morphine with the hypodermic needle marked a decisive turning point. It produced a method of delivering relief that was faster, stronger, and more efficient than anything that had existed previously. And it appeared just in time for a war. The American Civil War, which began in 1861, unfolded on an industrial scale of violence and devastation never seen before. The weapons were new and horrific. The Minié ball, a soft lead bullet, crushed bone and ripped through flesh so violently that amputation became the most common surgical response. Battlefields were transformed into scenes of almost unimaginable slaughter. The field hospitals were even more harrowing. Overworked surgeons labored in blood-soaked tents with little knowledge of sanitation, and an endless stream of wounded, screaming men. Pain became an enemy as formidable as the opposing army, and the military medical corps relied on two critical tools: chloroform for anesthesia and morphine to dull the brutal, lingering agony that followed injury. Morphine was distributed on an enormous scale. The Union Army alone purchased millions of opium pills and tens of thousands of ounces of morphine powder. It was given freely, often by medics who were exhausted and inadequately trained. It was without question a blessing. It saved countless soldiers from dying of shock and unbearable pain. It allowed them to survive what would otherwise have been impossible to endure. But when the war ended in 1865 and the surviving soldiers returned home, they carried more than physical wounds with them. Many had lost limbs, their bodies were permanently scarred, and their minds were haunted by what they had witnessed and done. And for a great number of them, there was another far more insidious injury: a persistent, gnawing dependence on the medicine that had stained them through the war. They had left the battlefield, but they could not abandon the needle or the small bottle of morphine solution. The condition became so widespread that it earned a name: the soldier's disease. It was the first modern epidemic of iatrogenic or physician-caused addiction. These men, once honored as heroes, were now often regarded as moral failures. Their morphinism became a private shame. They were the first generation to confront the grim paradox of this medical innovation. The cure for pain could generate a suffering of its own, a prison whose walls were built from relief itself. Medicine had solved one problem, the wild and unpredictable nature of opium, only to create a new and even more frightening one. The search for an answer had begun. The world needed a painkiller that possessed all the strength of morphine, but without its devastating curse of addiction. The world demanded a safer substitute, and in the gleaming state-of-the-art laboratories of a rising German chemical giant, a group of scientists believed they were close to achieving it. They were searching for a hero. The setting for the next chapter of this story is not an ancient battlefield or a makeshift hospital, but a place defined by modernity and industrial ambition. It is Elberfeld, Germany, in the closing years of the 19th century. And the central figure is not a single individual, but a corporation, Friedrich Bayer and Company. Bayer was an industrial titan, a chemical powerhouse whose fortune had not been built on medicine, but on color. They were experts in synthetic dyes, extracting brilliant blues and vivid reds from the black, sticky waste of coal tar. Their success rested on disciplined research, an unwavering belief in chemistry, and a sharp understanding of the market. After conquering the textile world, they redirected their formidable research and development machinery toward a new and even more profitable frontier pharmaceuticals. By 1897, their young pharmaceutical division had already achieved a remarkable breakthrough. They took a traditional remedy, salicylic acid, derived from willow bark, which was effective against fever and pain, but notoriously harsh on the stomach, and chemically altered it to create acetyl salicylic acid. This new compound was gentler and more effective than its predecessor. It would soon be introduced to the world under a new trade name, aspirin. It was a triumph of industrial chemistry, a perfect example of improving upon nature itself. The head of Bayer's pharmacology laboratory, a confident and driven professor named Heinrich Dresser, was eager to apply this same approach to another far more complex challenge. That challenge was morphine. By the 1890s, what had once been known as the soldier's disease was no longer confined to former servicemen. Dependence on morphine had spread into a widespread social crisis, touching people from every social class. Very often, individuals who had been given the drug legitimately to manage long-term medical conditions. It had become both a medical catastrophe and a public relations nightmare for the pharmaceutical industry. At the same time, physicians faced an urgent demand for effective treatments for respiratory illness. Tuberculosis, bronchitis, and pneumonia were claiming countless lives, and they shared a common and devastating symptom, a severe, relentless cough. This kind of coughing drained patients of their strength, robbed them of sleep, and accelerated their physical decline. The most reliable cough suppressant, or antitussive, available at the time was codeine. Codeine was another alkaloid derived from opium. It was considerably milder than morphine and was believed to carry a lower risk of addiction, but its very mildness was also its main limitation. In many cases, it simply was not potent enough to control the violent coughing spasms caused by serious lung disease. Morphine, by contrast, was highly effective at suppressing coughs. It worked by depressing the cough center in the brainstem. However, this benefit came with a grave danger. Morphine also suppressed the respiratory center located nearby. In the weak and fragile patients who needed relief the most, a dose strong enough to quiet the cough could just as easily be strong enough to stop breathing entirely. And beyond that, there was always the looming problem of addiction. This was the dilemma that Professor Dreiser placed before his research team. He wanted a new medication, one that matched morphine's ability to suppress coughing but lacked its deadly tendency to shut down respiration. Above all, he wanted a drug that did not cause addiction. He was convinced that it was possible through chemistry to separate the beneficial effects of morphine from its harmful ones. His ambition was to create a safe form of morphine. The responsibility for synthesizing this potential breakthrough fell to a young chemist working in his laboratory, Felix Hoffmann. Hoffmann was a careful, highly skilled chemist, the same individual who just 11 days earlier had successfully produced a stable and commercially viable form of aspirin. He was riding a wave of success. The technique he used was identical to the one he had applied to transform salicylic acid into aspirin acetylation. This was a standard chemical procedure involving the attachment of an acetyl group to a molecule in order to alter its properties. Hoffmann took purified morphine sourced from Bayer's extensive opium reserves and heated it with a substance known as acetic anhydride. The process was simple, though unpleasant to perform. The outcome was a new compound, a fine white crystalline powder. Its chemical name was diacetylmorphine, indicating that two acetyl groups had been added to the original morphine molecule. Hoffmann had completed his task and produced the compound. The next step was for Heinrich Dreiser to determine its effects. Dreiser began experimenting with the new substance in his laboratory, giving it the code name HEROIN. He started with animal testing using mice, guinea pigs, and rabbits. The initial results were highly promising. The compound proved to be an exceptionally powerful respiratory suppressant. It calmed the breathing of the animals far more effectively than codeine. Most importantly, at the doses being administered, it did not appear to produce the dangerously profound respiratory depression associated with morphine. At first glance, it seemed to offer a safer alternative. The research then progressed to human testing. These trials bore little resemblance to the carefully controlled, double-blind, placebo-based studies that are standard today. Dreiser and his colleagues began by testing the drug on themselves, then on laboratory assistants, and later on workers at the Bayer factory who were suffering from coughs. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive. The drug was extraordinarily effective. Even a very small dose could halt a persistent cough almost immediately, allowing patients to enjoy a restful night's sleep. However, another effect was observed, one that attracted particular attention. Test subjects reported a sensation of pleasant euphoria. They felt good, strong, mentally clear, and energized. One report even noted that the drug produced a sense of heroism. This detail sparked Dreiser's keen marketing instincts. He recognized the potential of the name. This was in his mind a heroic medicine capable of overcoming disease and relieving suffering. He officially named the drug heroin, drawing from the German word heroisch. Yet he envisioned its use as far more than a simple cough remedy. Based on incomplete data and deeply flawed assumptions, Dreiser became convinced that heroin was not addictive. He went even further, proposing that it might serve as a treatment for morphine addiction itself. His logic was tragically misguided. He believed that heroin could satisfy the body's craving for an opiate without causing the heavy sedation and mental dullness associated with morphine. He imagined that a person dependent on morphine could be switched to heroin, and then, because heroin was supposedly non-addictive, gradually taken off it with minimal discomfort. In his view, he had discovered the ultimate solution, a non-addictive substitute for morphine that could also cure morphine addiction. It appeared to be the ideal product. In November of 1898, Heinrich Dreiser stood before the Congress of German Naturalists and Physicians to present his research. He spoke enthusiastically about the strengths of his latest discovery, praising it without reservation. He asserted that it was 10 times more powerful as a cough suppressant than codeine, while producing only a small fraction of the side effects associated with morphine. He framed it as a medical marvel, clear proof of the brilliance of German scientific thought and the industrial strength of Bayer. The medical establishment was spellbound. Bayer responded without delay, launching an enormous international marketing effort. Complimentary samples of heroin were distributed to thousands of physicians throughout Europe and the United States. Articles soon appeared in respected medical journals applauding its effectiveness not only for coughs, but also for asthma, tuberculosis, and even whooping cough in children. The substance was offered in liquid form as tablets and as glycerin-based elixirs, designed to make it easier for younger patients to consume. It was promoted as a safe, non-addictive substitute. The hero had arrived seemingly destined to rescue the world from respiratory illness and from the burden of morphine dependence. The illusion, shaped by hopeful assumptions, imperfect science, and commercial drive, was now complete. A world longing for a miracle was eager to accept it. And with that, the trap was quietly laid. Bayer began manufacturing heroin by the ton, sending its small bottles of white powder to every corner of the globe. Unaware, or perhaps unwilling, to acknowledge that they were not ending an epidemic, but setting the stage for a catastrophe. The tale of a wonder drug often starts not with an explosion of fanfare, but with a cough, a dry, relentless, rasping cough, the kind that shook the chests of a world still shadowed by tuberculosis, pneumonia, and bronchitis. It was within this environment, standing on the threshold of the 20th century, that the German chemical powerhouse Friedrich Bayer and Company found itself in possession of what it believed to be a miracle. The company had developed a new compound diacetyl morphine synthesized by its chemist Felix Hoffmann during a careful, though ultimately disastrous effort to create a less addictive alternative to codeine. Early trials conducted on workers inside the Bayer factory in Elberfeld produced astonishing results. Reports claimed it was 10 times more effective as a painkiller than morphine, and as a cough suppressant, it seemed unrivaled. Even more crucially, the firm's chief pharmacologist, Heinrich Dreiser, announced with the firm certainty typical of late Victorian science that the compound lacked the hypnotic habit-forming properties of its parent drug. It was presented as a safer morphine, a superior codeine, a flawless medicine. All that remained was to give it a name. In searching for a brand that could reflect the compound's powerful and invigorating effects, the company looked to feedback from its test subjects. They described experiencing a deep sense of well-being, along with a surge of strength and confidence. They felt, as they put it, heroic. From the German word heroisch, the name was born. Heroin. The word sounded strong, modern, and entirely harmless. It carried the tone of an answer, a solution to persistent suffering. Bayer, a company whose reputation rested on careful science, and which was approaching worldwide prominence, thanks to another recent product, aspirin committed all of its industrial and marketing strength to this new wonder drug. The resulting campaign was a masterclass in global commerce. It was forceful, thorough, and astonishingly effective. Beginning in 1898, a torrent of promotional material flowed outward from Germany into the hands of doctors, pharmacists, and hospitals across the developed world. Free samples were sent out by the tens of thousands arriving in tidy packages on desks in physicians' offices from London to St. Louis, from Vienna to Shanghai. The containers themselves projected understated medical refinement. Small, clear glass bottles held a fine white crystalline powder sealed with cork stoppers and marked with the now famous Bayer Cross logo. The label, printed in sharp black lettering, announced the contents plainly. Heroin. For those seeking ease of use, it was compressed into tablets. For the most widespread complaint, coughing, it was mixed into a sweet glycerin-based elixir, making it acceptable even for children. Advertisements flourished in the pages of the world's most respected medical journals. One particularly striking advertisement from the period displayed the name heroin in bold Art Nouveau typography. Encircled by a long list of illnesses it claimed to defeat: coughs, bronchitis, tuberculosis, asthma, whooping cough. Another advertisement, bearing the Bayer emblem, stated simply, "Heroin the sedative for coughs." The company framed it not as a narcotic, but as a precise therapeutic instrument, a product of modern medicine. It did not merely suppress a cough, it healed the irritation behind it. It did not simply dull the pain of childbirth, it softened the entire experience. Most remarkably, and with an irony so deep that it would later define a true tragedy, Bayer promoted heroin as a treatment for addiction itself. It was advertised as a non-addictive remedy, supposedly capable of helping patients gradually free themselves from reliance on morphine or codeine. Physicians urgently seeking answers to the escalating crisis of iatrogenic opioid addiction. A crisis born from the heavy medical use of drugs from the previous generation, accepted this promise with profound relief. At last, it seemed there was an escape route, a means to ease pain and suffering without forging a new cage around the patient. And so, heroin entered everyday life, not through hidden alleys, but openly through the front counter of the pharmacy. It was available over the counter without any prescription in nearly every country where it was introduced. Someone battling a cold could step into a chemist's shop in Paris and buy a bottle of heroin hydrochloride as casually as purchasing soap. A mother living in rural America could order a plain heroin-based cough syrup for her child from a mail-order catalogue. It became just another branded medicine, another tool in the domestic collection used to fight common illness. It rested in medicine cabinets beside iodine and aspirin. Inside a small, modest bottle was a substance of nearly unimaginable potency, its heroic name reflecting the world's limitless confidence in chemistry as a pathway to a better life. For a brief, intoxicating span of years, it appeared that Bayer had genuinely provided a cure for the world's coughs, a soothing answer to pain, and a solution to addiction itself. The fine white powder was everywhere, a silent and ever-present promise of relief contained in every bottle. The world, it seemed, had found its hero. The first strands of this vast deception began to come undone, not through bold declarations from respected medical institutions, but through the quiet, anxious letters of everyday doctors. At first, they emerged as murmurs, scattered stories from the front lines of clinical practice. A physician in Philadelphia wrote a brief letter to a medical journal in 1900, noting with measured scientific curiosity that several of his tuberculosis patients whom he had prescribed heroin to suppress coughing appeared to need progressively larger doses to achieve the same result. Even more concerning, when these patients attempted to stop the medication, they experienced an unusual and severe form of restlessness and distress. A pharmacist in Boston observed that certain customers were returning for Bayer's cough elixir with unsettling regularity, their colds seemingly stretching on for months. They appeared pale thin and visibly agitated whenever the product was unavailable. In France, doctors treating morphine addiction with this new remedy noticed an alarming pattern. Their patients did stop using morphine, but they merely shifted their attachment to heroin with a fervor that was startling. This condition was labeled heroinism, and it proved to be far more aggressive and resistant than the dependence it was intended to cure. These were the earliest warnings, the subtle vibrations that precede a seismic rupture. For a time, they were brushed aside. When Bayer was challenged with these observations, the company confidently reassured the medical world that such incidents were isolated, likely the result of incorrect dosing or the psychological makeup of individual patients. The drug they maintained was non-habituating. Their studies were definitive, and for a while the world accepted their assurances. The medicine worked too well, the comfort it offered too complete for physicians to discard it, based on a handful of isolated accounts. The alternative was return to weaker, more visibly addictive codeine or the feared morphine itself. Yet the unraveling continued, and the whispers soon swelled into a unified alarm. The fundamental and catastrophic error behind Bayer's miracle was rooted in basic biochemistry, a detail tragically missed in their early investigations. Diacetylmorphine heroin was at its core a delivery mechanism. Its two acetyl groups made it far more fat-soluble than morphine, enabling it to pass through the blood-brain barrier with remarkable speed and efficiency. Once inside the brain, enzymes rapidly removed those acetyl groups, converting the substance back into morphine. The user was not experiencing a novel, non-addictive drug. They were receiving an intensified dose of morphine delivered straight to the brain's opioid receptors with a velocity that produced a stronger and more immediate euphoria. This rapid effect was central to both its apparent success and its devastating addictive strength. It created a feedback loop far more powerful than that of its slower-acting predecessor. Soon the concept of tolerance began to dominate medical journals. Physicians documented how a patient who once found relief with a single or 5 milligrams tablet soon required 10, then 20. The cough had long disappeared, but the demand for the drug persisted, reshaped into a relentless physical necessity. And with tolerance came the true terror withdrawal. The sense of unease recorded in those early letters soon acquired a far more precise and frightening language. What was being witnessed was nothing less than a total collapse of the body's systems. Physicians documented the symptoms with an almost stunned detachment, relentless yawning eyes and nose pouring with fluid, heavy sweating, followed by waves of chills and raised gooseflesh, a reaction that would later inspire the stark slang term cold turkey. After that came violent muscle spasms, repeated vomiting, diarrhea, sleeplessness, and a crushing weight of anxiety and hopelessness. This was the torment of morphine withdrawal, yet many doctors observed that it arrived more quickly and at least subjectively felt far more intense. A body stripped of the substance it had been reprogrammed to rely on was protesting with every signal it could produce. The illusion had been fully exposed. The celebrated cure for morphine dependence was not only addictive itself. By some estimates, it was 2 to 3 times more powerful and created a dependency that was far more difficult to overcome. The complementary samples so widely distributed by Bayer had effectively become a massive uncontrolled clinical experiment, and the findings were flooding in. Sanatoriums and asylums, once dominated by alcoholics and morphine users, began reporting an entirely new category of patient, the heroin habitué. At first, these individuals were not shadowy figures from the criminal underworld. They were teachers, clerks, housewives and laborers, ordinary people who had been given a cough suppressant and had unknowingly stepped into a chemical snare with no simple way out. The very physicians who had once promoted the drug now faced the enormous challenge of reversing the harm they had unintentionally unleashed. The medicine cabinet, formerly a symbol of safety and relief, had become for thousands a prison. By 1905, the American Medical Association removed heroin from its list of approved treatments, erasing its name from the roster of new and non-official remedies. The medical establishment, once its strongest supporter, was beginning to abandon its fallen champion. The deception had completely unraveled, leaving behind shattered dependencies and a crisis that was poised to move beyond clinics and into public life. The transition from medicine to menace did not happen overnight. It was a slow, souring evolution that unfolded over the first 15 years of the new century. As respectable doctors grew cautious and then openly antagonistic toward heroin, a deep shift took place in how the drug was used and by whom. Stripped of its medical legitimacy, it did not vanish. Instead, it drifted downward, slipping out of the sterile confines of pharmacies and into the darker, unregulated corners of city life. The user population began to change. The middle-class patient with a lingering cough gave way to a different audience. Disillusioned soldiers returning from the Spanish-American War, laborers crowded into expanding industrial cities, petty criminals, prostitutes and residents of urban vice districts. These were people living at society's edges for whom the drug's intense euphoric escape was not an unwanted side effect, but its central attraction. Methods of use shifted as well. the era of the sweet medicinal syrup was ending. New users purchased the powder, now produced by less scrupulous chemical companies, or diverted from legitimate channels, and they discovered that its effects were stronger when it was not swallowed, but inhaled. Sniffing gatherings became common within bohemian circles and underworld scenes in cities such as New York. Not long after the most efficient and dangerous method of all gained popularity injection. The hypodermic syringe, a relatively recent medical invention, became the instrument that finalized the drug's reputation. It enabled the most immediate and powerful delivery, but it also introduced new terrors, abscesses, infections, and the rapid spread of disease. Heroin was no longer a treatment. It was a shocker fix. Its new identity was being shaped in darkness. This transformation unfolded alongside a period of intense social anxiety in the United States. The progressive era was at its height, marked by sweeping reforms, but also by deep fears. Fear of accelerating industrialization, of overcrowded cities, of large waves of immigrants arriving from southern and eastern Europe, and of mounting racial tensions. Within this volatile climate, heroin addiction became more than an individual misfortune. It was portrayed as a social infection, a danger to the nation's very foundation. Newspapers, eager for sensationalism, ran lurid headlines about dope fiends and drug-driven criminals. In the public imagination, heroin became intertwined with vice, crime, and foreignness. It was no longer seen as a German miracle cure. It was recast as a corrosive poison eroding America's youth and eating away at its moral fiber. The addict who had once been regarded as a patient, a tragic individual deserving compassion and care, was now redefined as a dope fiend, a threatening and morally flawed deviant, to be feared, controlled, and punished. This surge of moral panic shaped the political atmosphere that made federal intervention possible. For many years, laws governing narcotics had existed as a fragmented mix of state and local regulations, often inconsistent and poorly coordinated. But momentum was shifting. A powerful drive for federal oversight was gathering force, fueled by an alliance of reformers, diplomats, and law enforcement authorities. Central to this campaign was Dr. Hamilton Wright, an intense and ambitious physician, appointed as the first Opium Commissioner of the United States. Wright viewed narcotics addiction less as a medical condition, and more as a moral failing and an international embarrassment. He believed that America's internal drug problem disgraced the nation and weakened its reputation on the global stage, and he worked relentlessly to secure federal law that would place the drug trade firmly under government authority. His campaign, strengthened by international pressure from conferences held in Shanghai and The Hague, laid the groundwork for historic legislation. The outcome was the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, approved by Congress in December of 1914. At face value, the act was not designed as a prohibition measure. Instead, it was a tax statute justified under the federal government's constitutional right to impose taxes. It mandated that anyone who imported, produced, sold, or distributed cocaine or opium-derived substances, including heroin and morphine, must register with the federal government, pay a special tax, and use designated order forms. Physicians were allowed to prescribe these substances, but only within the course of professional practice. Hidden inside that seemingly harmless condition was a dramatic shift. The critical issue became how legitimate professional practice was defined, something the law itself failed to clarify. That authority fell to those enforcing the act, particularly the Bureau of Internal Revenue within the Treasury Department. The Treasury Department, staffed by law enforcement officials rather than medical professionals, adopted a strict and punitive interpretation. They swiftly concluded that prescribing narcotics to an addict simply to sustain an existing dependency did not qualify as valid medical treatment. In their view, it was merely indulging a vice. The fallout from this interpretation was swift and devastating. Physicians who had compassionately maintained addicted patients on stable legal doses of heroin or morphine suddenly found themselves exposed to criminal liability. A sequence of Supreme Court rulings in the years following the Harrison Act reinforced the government's stance, effectively turning the medical management of addiction into a crime. Thousands of doctors were intimidated, arrested, and prosecuted. Afraid of losing their licenses and their freedom, most American physicians abandoned the treatment of addicts altogether. They shut their doors on the patients who needed care the most. This single law, born from a blend of sincere intentions and moral hysteria, permanently reshaped the reality of addiction in the United States. It did not eliminate heroin use. It simply eliminated its legal availability. Responsibility for the problem was pulled away from the medical profession and handed over to the criminal justice system. With doctors removed from the equation, the many users who had depended on a regulated lawful supply were left desperate. They were ill, suffering withdrawal, and now labeled criminals. Their only option was the street, and the street was prepared to receive them. By cutting off legal access, the Harrison Act created ideal conditions for an illegal market to thrive. The void left by physicians and pharmacists was filled by a new character, the professional drug dealer. Prices for heroin on the black market soared. Purity became dangerously inconsistent, often diluted with quinine sugar or far worse substances. A public health emergency was officially converted into a crime epidemic. In order to afford the inflated costs of their now illicit medicine, users were frequently driven into theft, prostitution, and other criminal acts. The legislation had not resolved heroin addiction. It had given birth to the modern American drug underworld. The small bottle that once rested quietly in the medicine cabinet disappeared. In its place appeared the police officer, the jail cell, and the shadowy dealer offering an unknown powder in a dark alley. The once celebrated cure, after misleading the world, was officially recast as a threat pushed into the very shadows it would come to define for the next century. The law, with its boundless and often misguided certainty, had slammed one door shut. Through the Harrison Act, related bans, and international agreements. If the era of legal heroin was declared finished. Yet, within the vast and drafty structure of global commerce, another entrance had begun to open a back door quieter and far more profitable. Nature, and especially the nature of commerce, does not tolerate an empty space, and the void left behind by Bayer, by Merck, and by the vast ranks of physicians who had once prescribed their miracle remedy, was enormous, deep, and practically demanding to be filled. Stepping directly into that emptiness were men who understood supply and demand more intuitively than any economist, men who wore fedoras instead of lab coats, and who calculated profit not in quarterly earnings, but in kilos and body counts. The modern heroin trade, the one that would cast a long shadow over the rest of the 20th century, did not emerge from a corporate boardroom. It was born under the blazing sun of the poppy fields spread across the Anatolian plateau of Turkey. For generations, farmers there had cultivated Papaver somniferum, carefully slicing its pods to collect the thick, milky opium resin. Much of this harvest entered the legal marketplace, processed into morphine base for hospitals around the world. Yet a certain portion, a quiet and unspoken surplus, was always set aside, available to those with money and a talent for discretion. In that moment, the first link of a new and unseen chain was created. From the Turkish fields, the raw opium or refined morphine base began its westward passage. Its destination was a city steeped in Sierre, garlic, and secrets. Marseille, France's oldest city, and a busy Mediterranean port, proved to be the ideal crucible. It was home to the Corsican syndicates, known collectively as the Milieu. These men were not flamboyant criminals. They were tight-knit, merciless, and practical families of smugglers who had sharpened their skills, moving illicit cigarettes and alcohol. Figures like Paul Carbone and François Spirito understood the shipping routes, the customs officials who could be persuaded, and the secluded inlets where cargo could be quietly unloaded in the middle of the night. They recognized the opportunity instantly. This white powder weighed less than liquor and was worth more than gold. They established laboratories not within the city itself, but hidden among quiet villas and rural farmhouses in Provence, nestled in rocky hills overlooking the Azure Sea. There they hired the true magicians of this emerging enterprise, the chemists. Some were renegades, skilled defectors from the legitimate pharmaceutical world, men fluent in the delicate interaction between acetic anhydride and morphine base. They practiced a dark form of artistry. Taking the rough brown slabs of morphine base from Turkey, they subjected them to a meticulous and dangerous refinement. They washed and filtered, heated and cooled, repeating the process until a substance of remarkable purity emerged. This was not the beige or brown powder that would later become common. This was heroin number 4, light brilliant white, and often testing at 98% purity. It was the finest heroin on earth, and it would become known simply as the French Connection. The logistics behind this operation were a triumph of criminal creativity. The finished product, sealed into 1 kilo packages, had to make its way across the Atlantic. The concealment methods were ingenious and varied. The heroin was hidden inside the panels of a brand new Buick shipped from a Paris showroom to a buyer in New York. It was stitched into the linings of luxury suitcases and carried by elegantly dressed couriers aboard transatlantic liners such as the SS Ile-de-France. It was concealed in barrels of fish, inside hollowed statues, and among crates of French wine. The Corsicans served as manufacturers and exporters, excelling at their role, but they still required a distributor, a trusted partner waiting on the far shore. That partner was found in the Italian-American Mafia. After World War II, Charles Lucky Luciano, exile to Italy, yet still commanding his criminal empire from afar, saw what was coming. Along with his associates in the 5 families of New York City, he controlled the docks, the labor unions, and the trucking routes. They were the gatekeepers to America's largest city. An agreement was made. The Corsicans would deliver the product, and the mafia would manage everything that followed. They became the wholesalers, breaking down massive multi-kilo shipments and selling them to mid-level dealers, who then distributed the drug on the streets of New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia. For decades, this pipeline operated with near legendary efficiency. It functioned as a finely tuned international machine, a shadow corporation complete with its own supply chains, manufacturing centers, and global distribution network. It transformed a Turkish farmer's crop worth only a few $100s into merchandise that generated millions once it reached the streets of America. The quiet cough medicine now outlawed had discovered new corporate backers far more committed and far more deadly than Bayer had ever been. In attempting to confine a monster, the world had instead handed the keys to the keepers of the underworld. They did not merely release it, they nourished it, empowered it, and taught it to stalk every corner of the planet. And in a humid, war-scarred jungle half a world away, that creature was about to encounter an entirely new and tragically captive audience. The French Connection operated as an orderly, if ruthless enterprise, a straightforward line running from poppy fields to ports, and finally to the streets. Yet history is almost never that clean or predictable. While Corsican networks refined and disciplined their European trafficking routes, a far more chaotic and unstable reality was taking shape in Southeast Asia. The area known as the Golden Triangle, the rugged and lawless highlands where Burma, Thailand, and Laos meet, was and had been for a very long time the largest opium-producing region on Earth. In this landscape, the trade was not governed by a single tightly run organization. Instead, it was a turbulent free-for-all involving warlords, corrupt officials, and guerrilla armies, many of whom were quietly supported by Cold War-era intelligence agencies, including the CIA as a counterweight to communism. They financed their forces with opium. It was the jungle's currency. Then America entered that jungle, stepping directly into an already overflowing and deeply entrenched opiate market. The United States sent more than 500,000 young men into the conflict, soldiers who were mostly teenagers torn from their homes and plunged into an alien world of crushing heat, constant fear, and endless boredom. The purpose of the war was unclear. The enemy seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere at once, and the long days were broken only by sudden moments of shum terror. All the ingredients were in place. On one side was a concentrated local supply of the purest heroin the world had ever encountered. Urucabos refined in mobile laboratories hidden deep in the jungle. This substance was known as China White, and it was astonishingly cheap. A vial holding 1/10 of a gram of 95% pure heroin could be purchased on the streets of Saigon or near the edge of a firebase for just $2. On the other side stood an army of isolated, frightened, and disenchanted young men. For them, heroin was not a recreational indulgence. It was treatment. It was an escape capsule from an unbearable reality. It softened the heat. It pushed the fear into the background. It erased the endless waiting. With a single hit, a soldier could feel as though the war had vanished for a few hours. It became the ultimate anesthetic for the soul. One detail, however, proved decisive. The way the drug was consumed was different. Back in the States, heroin was associated with needles, with injecting directly into a vein, a frightening and taboo step for a beginner. In Vietnam, the drug was so pure that injection was unnecessary to achieve a powerful effect. It could be smoked. Often it was sprinkled into a cigarette or heated on a piece of tinfoil, with the user drawing in the smoke through a tube, a ritual known as chasing the dragon. This single factor transformed everything. It reduced the psychological barrier to entry almost completely. It was just smoking, no needles, no visible marks, no shared syringes. It was simple, discreet, and seemingly clean. One GI could try it, experience the profound release, and pass it along to a friend. The habit spread through platoons, through barracks, through entire divisions. An epidemic unfolded in plain sight. Military leadership was slow to understand how widespread the problem had become. Initially, it was dismissed as a matter of discipline, the actions of a handful of bad apples. But by the late 1960s, denial was no longer possible. Medics were responding to overdoses. Officers were discovering soldiers falling asleep while on guard duty. Quiet rumors swelled into an outcry that eventually reached Washington, D.C. When the data was finally assembled, it was shocking. A 1971 Department of Defense study estimated that 40,000 U.S. servicemen in Vietnam were addicted to heroin. Some members of Congress believed that between 15 to 20% of all enlisted men had used it. The White House reacted with alarm. President Richard Nixon foresaw a looming disaster, a wave of trained, armed, and addicted soldiers returning home. The situation was framed not as a medical emergency, but as a threat to national security, an infiltration by an internal enemy. In June of 1971, Nixon delivered a well-known speech in which he labeled drug abuse public enemy number one. This moment marked the official launch of the war on drugs. Its first major offensive was known as Operation Golden Flow. The policy was blunt, sweeping, and driven by desperation. Every American soldier was required to pass a urinalysis test before boarding a plane back home. Those who failed were forced to remain in Vietnam for detoxification. The program was deeply flawed. Soldiers learned how to cheat the tests. Detox facilities were thrown together quickly and were often harsh. But the program's most lasting impact was the formal identification of thousands of addicted young men. They were no longer seen simply as soldiers. They were addicts, a label that would follow them back to the United States. And once they returned, the true ordeal began. There were no welcoming parades, only protests. Many were condemned for their involvement in an unpopular war. Worse still, the drug they had relied on, the cheap, pure, smokable China White, was not available at home. The heroin found on the streets of New York and Los Angeles was the product of the French Connection. It was expensive, often costing $50 a fix, and it was heavily diluted with substances like quinine lactose or worse. Its purity rarely exceeded 5 to 10%. It was far too weak to be smoked. to recreate the same sensation they had grown used to in the jungle. The soldiers who came home were left with a single option. They had to reach for a needle. In doing so, they became the new image of the American heroin addict. They were not jazz performers or beatnik poets. They were ordinary young men. The boys next door, the high school football standouts who had been sent overseas to fight a war and returned carrying a wound far deeper and far more corrosive than any fragment of shrapnel. Their dependence, forged in the trauma of combat, was now interpreted as a moral flaw, a personal weakness. They were rejected by the Veterans Administration, which had neither the tools nor the understanding to address this kind of crisis. Law enforcement turned its attention toward them. They found themselves lost in the very country they had been sent to protect their private war, continuing long after the final helicopter lifted off from the roof of the American embassy in Saigon. They became the seeds of a contagion scattered by the winds of war into the fertile ground of a nation already beginning to rot from within. The returning veterans formed a new stream feeding an expanding river of addiction, and that river flowed straight into the core of America's cities. The 1970s marked a time of deep and painful change. The post-war boom had ended. The country was trapped in stagflation, a disturbing mix of economic stagnation and soaring inflation. The great industrial machines of the Northeast and Midwest started to falter and shut down. Factories that had once produced the nation's cars, steel, and household appliances were closed, their gates locked, their windows shattered. A vast wave of deindustrialization rolled across urban America. As the jobs disappeared, so did the people who had the means to leave. White flight intensified as middle-class families, both black and white, moved toward the promise of the suburbs. What remained was an emptied urban core, a terrain of decaying infrastructure, poorly funded schools, and fading hope. The tax base vanished. City services deteriorated. Landlords walked away from apartment buildings, which soon became magnets for crime and despair. Entire neighborhoods in places such as the South Bronx, Harlem, Detroit, and Newark began to look like battlefields. And within this environment of collapse, heroin found the conditions it needed to thrive. The logic was simple and merciless. When the legitimate economy falls apart, the underground economy flourishes. For a young man in an overlooked neighborhood with no job and no future, the drug trade offered one of the few available routes to money, status, and power. It became a distorted version of the American dream. The mafia, the long-established wholesalers behind the French Connection, remained at the top of the hierarchy. They were willing to sell to anyone capable of moving their product. But at street level, a new type of entrepreneur was taking shape. In Harlem, a man named Leroy Nicky Barnes recognized the opening. Barnes was intelligent, magnetic, and completely ruthless. He had no interest in remaining a small-time street dealer. Instead, he chose to impose order on chaos. He traveled to Italy to negotiate directly with the mafia's suppliers. He formed an organization known as the Council, a 7-man board made up of leading black drug traffickers in New York City. They pooled their resources, streamlined distribution, managed their own legal matters, and violently wiped out their rivals. In practice, they operated like a Fortune 500 corporation devoted entirely to heroin distribution. Barnes grew so influential and so bold that New York Times Magazine placed him on its cover in 1977 with the headline, Mr. Untouchable. To some, he was a folk hero, to others, a monster. Above all, he was a product of his surroundings, a symptom of a far deeper sickness. The drug itself evolved into a brand. It was no longer sold in plain, anonymous bags. Dealers began stamping their glassine envelopes with logos and names. A form of street-level marketing meant to create loyalty and advertise the strength or supposed strength of what was inside. Labels such as DOA Red Dragon Poison, Death Wish, The Last Ride. This practice transformed a basic commodity into a fetish object, a symbol of the nihilism that had taken hold in these communities. Purchasing a bag of heroin was no longer just a financial exchange. It became a declaration. The social structure of these neighborhoods was torn apart. The heroin economy produced a self-reinforcing cycle of ruin. Addiction drove a dramatic rise in property crime. Muggings, break-ins, and shoplifting surged as users scrambled to secure the $50, then $100, then $200 a day required to sustain their habit. Abandoned buildings turned into shooting galleries, filthy and dangerous places where addicts could disappear to get high out of sight of the world. Families were destroyed. The children who grew up in this environment, the crack babies of the following decade, entered a world where the nodding addict on the corner was as familiar a presence as the mailman. The level of violence was shocking. Territorial battles exploded as rival gangs clashed over the most profitable street corners. Law enforcement, stretched thin and frequently compromised, fought a frantic struggle they were destined to lose. The courts turned into a spinning wheel. For every dealer taken into custody, 10 more were prepared to step forward. It was a spreading rot that appeared to have no remedy. By the end of the 1970s, the old power structure was beginning to crumble. The French Connection was at last dismantled through the relentless efforts of American and French authorities. Nicky Barnes, known as Mr. Untouchable, was finally brought down, betrayed by one of his own council members, and sentenced to life in prison. Yet it changed nothing. The system they had helped create was now capable of sustaining itself. Demand had become deeply rooted. The distribution networks were firmly established. When the French supply route was severed, new sources from Mexico and the Golden Triangle quickly moved in to fill the gap. When Barnes was removed from the streets, his lieutenants merely turned on one another to divide his territory. The small, unassuming medicine developed in the Bayer laboratory had completed its long and peculiar journey. It had moved from the shelves of pharmacies through corporate boardrooms across the fields of Turkey into the clandestine laboratories of Marseille, over the Atlantic, inside the hulls of ships, through the jungles of Vietnam, and finally arrived here in the wounded and fractured heart of the American city. It was no longer a miraculous treatment for a cough. It had become the bloodstream of an underground economy, a source of enormous criminal wealth, and a symbol of deep social breakdown. The so-called non-addictive substitute for morphine had found its final and most loyal following among the vast ranks of the dispossessed, offering a brief illusion of calm in a world that had given them none. The war in Vietnam produced an unexpected shift in the map of desire. While American focus was locked on deltas and jungles, another struggle, quieter and far more patient, was unfolding in the mountains to the north and west. There in the misty blue-green highlands where Burma, Laos and Thailand meet the land itself, was turned into a weapon. This region, the Shan Plateau, was a harsh and lawless territory, covering nearly 100,000 square miles. It was a landscape of deep valleys and cloud-covered peaks, reachable only by mule train or, for the especially fortunate, by a fragile landing strip carved into a hillside. For generations, its isolated ethnic communities had grown the opium poppy. It was a cash crop, a traditional remedy, and a simple part of rural life. That balance shifted in the mid-20th century when this pastoral practice was transformed by the remnants of a forgotten war. When Mao Zedong's communist forces prevailed in China in 1949, the defeated survivors of Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang army, known as the KMT, fled southward. Thousands of these soldiers, cut off from their homeland, crossed into the Shan states of Burma. They were an army without a nation, but they remained disciplined, heavily armed, and intensely practical. They saw the poppy fields not as agriculture, but as income, a way to finance their long and patient hope of someday reclaiming the mainland. And so they began their work. The KMT organized local poppy farmers, primarily from the Hmong and Shan ethnic groups, into a unified production system. They imposed a tax paid in raw opium and shielded the growers from interference by the weak, newly independent Burmese government. In effect, they became the rulers of this mountainous realm, their authority enforced at gunpoint. The logistical challenge was immense. Raw opium, a sticky dark resin scraped from poppy pods, had to be moved from thousands of remote hillside plots. Mule caravans, sometimes stretching hundreds of animals, long wound their way through dangerous mountain passes under the guard of KMT soldiers heading toward the border with Thailand. There, in improvised laboratories concealed deep within the jungle, the first transformation occurred. The opium was boiled, mixed with lime, and processed into a chalky, brittle morphine base. Blocks of this material, stamped with the KMT's official seal of 2 crossed flags, became the currency of the highlands. But global demand was evolving. Morphine no longer satisfied the market. What buyers wanted was diacetyl morphine heroin, purer, stronger, and far more profitable. At first, the KMT lacked the chemical knowledge to produce it. That changed in the late 1950s and 60s when chemists from Shanghai and Hong Kong themselves, fleeing communist rule, were drawn into the mountains. They carried with them the understanding of acetylation, the straightforward yet essential process of adding acetic anhydride to morphine base, and with it the final step in the transformation. Suddenly, the jungle laboratories were capable of producing far more than morphine. They could now turn out kilos of pure white No. 4 heroin. The renowned WSO Globe brand emerged a product of extraordinary purity that became synonymous with the Golden Triangle's lethal efficiency. The sheer magnitude of this operation is hard to grasp. By the early 70s, this region was generating an estimated 700 tons of raw opium each year, enough to supply the entire American market and a large share of Europe's as well. It functioned like a state within a state, a narco-kingdom constructed on the cultivation of a single flower. The Vietnam War, raging to the east, served both as a trigger and as camouflage. The Central Intelligence Agency, driven by its intense anti-communist campaign, viewed the KMT and other local militias as convenient proxies against the Pathet Lao in Laos and the Viet Cong. The CIA's proprietary airline Air America, officially a civilian operation, transported supplies into isolated airstrips scattered across the region. The aircraft that delivered weapons and ammunition did not always depart empty. More often than not, they carried opium and heroin on the return journey, a practical backhaul that helped bankroll the agency's regional allies. It was a tightly sealed system of necessity and plausible deniability. The war also created a new and captive market. American soldiers stationed in Vietnam, stressed, demoralized and bored, found the high-purity heroin coming across the border to be cheap, abundant, and an effective escape. Small vials of pure white powder could be purchased on the streets of Saigon for only a few dollars. By the end of the conflict, an estimated 15% of returning GIs were addicted to heroin, a catastrophic legacy that flowed back into American cities. And then there were the warlords. Over time, the KMT's dominance splintered, allowing local figures who had learned the trade to seize control for themselves. The most famous or infamous of these figures was a man named Chang Chi-fu, better known internationally by his nom de guerre Kun Sa. Of mixed Chinese and Shan descent, he possessed a keen understanding of branding and political spectacle. He portrayed himself not as a drug trafficker, but as a revolutionary, the head of the Shan United Army fighting for an independent Shan state. That struggle, of course, was financed entirely by heroin. At his height in the 1980s, Kun Sa controlled an estimated 70% of the Golden Triangle's production. He commanded a private force of 20,000 men equipped even with surface-to-air missiles. He constructed a vast fortified base at Haumong near the Thai border, effectively a small city with schools, a hospital, and even a holiday inn for visiting business partners. He regularly staged press conferences in the jungle, flanked by armed troops lecturing journalists about Shan nationalism, while his convoys, protected by those same soldiers, transported enormous quantities of heroin toward the coast. For decades, the Golden Triangle functioned as a geopolitical black hole. It corrupted governments in Bangkok and Rangoon, bankrolled years of unresolved civil war in Burma, and inundated the world with what seemed like an endless stream of white powder. It was a perfectly self-perpetuating ecosystem of violence, politics, and chemistry, hidden in plain sight, and flourishing in the quiet isolation of the mountains. The heroin leaving those hills traveled through an intricate network of brokers in Thailand, pirates in the South China Sea, and couriers aboard commercial airliners, and as it moved westward, it seeped into the cultural bloodstream, eventually manifesting in an unexpected and deeply unsettling form. This new expression did not appear in the jungles of Southeast Asia, but beneath the harsh, sterile lighting of a fashion photographer's studio. The transition was as subtle as a shift in the weather. The glossy, vibrant, athletic bodies of the 1980s supermodels. The Cindy Crawfords, the Naomi Campbells, women who embodied health and vitality began to feel outdated. A new decade, the 1980s, ushered in a different atmosphere marked by fatigue cynicism and a post-Cold War ennui. It was the age of grunge music, of Generation X indifference, and fashion aesthetics began to mirror this cultural downturn. The change first appeared in the pages of avant-garde British magazines, such as The Face and ID, promoted by a new generation of photographers who rejected the slick perfection of those who came before them. They favoured imagery that felt raw, unfiltered, and documentary in tone. Shoots took place in cheap apartments, on dirty streets, and in dull, in-between spaces. Their subjects, the models themselves, also changed. They were unnaturally thin, almost skeletal. Their skin appeared pale and translucent. Dark circles framed their eyes. Their expressions seemed empty, and their poses looked awkward, as if frozen mid-stumble. It was an image of deep exhaustion and alienation, a look that anyone familiar with it would immediately recognize as the unmistakable appearance of a heroin user. This became known as heroin chic. The phrase itself was intentionally provocative, first surfacing in the media in the mid-90s to describe this widespread and disturbing trend. It was never an official marketing label, of course. No fashion designer or glossy magazine editor would ever have chosen it deliberately, yet it managed to express perfectly the spirit of the look they were promoting. The clear and unmistakable face of this movement was a young, fragile-looking model from Croydon, London, named Kate Moss. Her work with photographer Corinne Day for the British edition of Vogue in 1993 marked what would become the defining moment of the era. The images taken inside Moss's own small and plainly furnished apartment were raw and stripped of glamour. She appeared in simple underwear. Her figure was slight and unembellished. Her expression seemed distant and unfocused. This visual world stood in stark contrast to the sun-drenched beaches and luxurious couture gowns that normally filled the magazine's pages. This was beauty presented as delicacy, as exposure, as a form of damaged allure. And it was seen as revolutionary. It struck a chord with a generation exhausted by artificial perfection. The style spread rapidly through the upper levels of fashion. Designers such as Calvin Klein constructed entire campaigns around it, relying on stark black and white photographs, images of hollow-cheeked young faces staring emptily from billboards, the androgynous appearance of the models, and the softening of traditional gender boundaries all contributed to its appeal. It turned away from the overt dominant sexuality of the 80s and replaced it with something quieter, more uncertain and withdrawn. The underlying message suggested retreat, a pulling back from a world that felt overwhelming or devoid of meaning. The clothes themselves echoed this sensibility. Slip dresses draped over bony frames like worn rags. Oversized sweaters muted tones, greys, beiges, and blacks. The overall effect was styled as a kind of fashionable surrender. Music intensified the atmosphere. The pain-filled lyrics of Kurt Cobain, along with the dark, brooding sounds of bands such as Portishead and Massive Attack, offered the ideal soundtrack for this visual culture of decay. And the connection went beyond appearance alone. Kurt Cobain's personal battle with heroin was widely known, lending a bleak sense of authenticity to the trend. Musicians, artists, and actors' figures central to popular culture were dying because of the drug. At the same time, the image of addiction was being packaged, cleaned up and sold back to the public as the ultimate form of cool. But another central figure was the Italian photographer David Sorrenti. His work for magazines including Dutour and Ray Gun helped cement the raw, drug-fueled reality of youth culture in downtown New York. His photographs felt intimate and unsettling at once, beautiful and deeply disturbing. They were not staged illusions. He and those around him were living the very life they were capturing on film. The fundamental issue, however, was the deep irresponsibility behind it all. High fashion, a multi-billion-dollar industry that influences global standards of beauty and desire, was actively romanticizing the appearance of a terminal illness. It removed the true reality of addiction, the illness, the desperation, the criminality, the filth, the overdoses, and erased their horror. In their place, it presented only surface symbols: thin bodies, pale skin, emotional detachment. It was a perilous illusion. It transformed a lethal drug into something that appeared romantic and poetic, a tragic badge of honor for the sensitive creative soul. When the backlash arrived, it was intense. Public health authorities, addiction experts, and parent organizations reacted with alarm. They recognized the images for what they truly were: a reckless normalization of self-destruction. In May of 1997, President Bill Clinton delivered a speech in which he openly criticized the fashion industry. "The glorification of heroin is not creative," he stated. "It is destructive. It is not beautiful. It all is ugly. And this is not about art. It is about life and death." The industry, which for years had brushed aside criticism by appealing to artistic freedom, suddenly found itself under pressure. Yet the real breaking point, the moment that shattered the illusion completely, had occurred earlier that same year. In February 1997, David Sorrenti, the gifted young photographer who had embodied the heroin chic aesthetic, so completely died. He was discovered in his New York apartment, surrounded by heroin paraphernalia. His death was caused by a lifelong blood disorder made perhaps worse by his heroin use. He was only 20 years old. Sorrenti's death sent shockwaves through the fashion world. It forced reality to intrude violently into a carefully constructed fantasy. This was no longer an abstract look or concept. It was the death of a young man. In response, his mother, the photographer Francesca Sorrenti, began a public campaign called Awareness, the David Sorrenti Appeal, with the aim of putting an end to the glamorization of drugs within the fashion industry. The industry was shamed and slowly began to pull back. Magazine editors released statements pledging a renewed emphasis on health and well-being. Models started to appear slightly stronger, a little more present, less hollowed out. The lighting grew brighter. The era of heroin chic faded almost as quickly as it had arrived. Yet it left behind an odd and persistent cultural aftertaste. For a brief moment, it had made the abyss seem stylish. It had wrapped despair in the language of luxury. And while the fashion world distanced itself from images of the street junkie, a far more dangerous and vastly more widespread opioid crisis was quietly building momentum, not in the grim alleyways of the Lower East Side, but inside the clean, respectable carpeted offices of pharmaceutical corporations. The next surge of addiction would not be murmured about in secrecy. It would arrive with a doctor's signature, handed over in a small orange bottle bearing a label that promised with scientific authority that it was safe. As the 21st century approached, many experienced the moment as an age of medical breakthroughs, and among the most celebrated achievements was the supposed victory over pain. For years, the medical establishment had been deeply cautious about prescribing powerful opioids for chronic non-cancer pain. The danger of addiction was judged to be too great. But in the mid-90s, a profound change in thinking began to take shape, a change that was no accident, but the result of one of the most sophisticated and misleading marketing campaigns ever devised in pharmaceutical history. The designers of this transformation were a privately owned company based in Stamford, Connecticut, known as Purdue Pharma, controlled by the secretive and extraordinarily wealthy Sackler family. In 1996, Purdue introduced a new medication called OxyContin. Its active ingredient was oxycodone, a potent semi-synthetic opioid that had existed for decades and was widely recognized as highly addictive. Purdue insisted, however, that their pill was different. It used a patented time-release system, a special coating called Contin, engineered to dispense the drug gradually over a 12-hour period. This, Purdue claimed, flattened the highs and lows of the drug's effect, removing the euphoric surge that led to misuse and addiction. Their core marketing assertion, a claim they promoted with relentless intensity, was that the risk of addiction from OxyContin was less than 1%. It was an astonishingly persuasive claim, and one entirely without factual foundation. Purdue Pharma launched a marketing offensive of unprecedented reach and magnitude. They more than doubled their sales force, assembling an army of representatives who focused not on pain specialists but on general practitioners and family doctors in small towns and rural communities across the nation, treating everyday injuries, arthritis, and back pain. These representatives carried misleading charts, selectively framed studies funded by Purdue itself, and a clear, emotionally charged message: doctors were failing their patients by allowing them to live with pain. At the same time, a new idea gained traction within the medical community, encouraged in part by Purdue's influence that pain should be addressed as the fifth vital sign, as critical as blood pressure or heart rate. On the surface, it sounded compassionate. In practice, it placed immense pressure on physicians to eradicate pain at any cost. Purdue positioned itself as the provider of the perfect and effortless solution. The rewards were substantial. Sales representatives earned enormous bonuses tied directly to how much OxyContin was prescribed within their assigned territories. Doctors, in turn, were lavished with attention and benefits. Purdue flew thousands of them to all-expenses-paid pain management conferences at sunny resort destinations in Florida and California. There they were treated to lavish meals and soothing presentations by paid medical experts who minimized the dangers of addiction. The company distributed branded fishing hats, coffee mugs, and even swing music CDs titled "Get in the Swing" with OxyContin. It was a comprehensive effort to reshape medical culture, to retrain an entire generation of physicians, and to persuade them that this powerful narcotic was a safe, non-addictive wonder drug. And it succeeded. Prescriptions for OxyContin soared. Sales climbed from 48 million in its first year to more than $1 billion just 4 years later. The medication was prescribed for everything from post-surgical pain to chronic back problems to fibromyalgia. Purdue deliberately targeted regions with high rates of workplace injuries, areas such as Appalachia, the Rust Belt, and rural Maine, transforming entire communities into epicenters of a growing epidemic. The fundamental deception, of course, lay in the time-release formulation. It took little time for users to discover that the full dose of oxycodone could be released all at once, simply by crushing the pill and snorting the powder, or dissolving it in water and injecting the solution. This completely bypassed the time-release system, unleashing an intense heroin-like wave of euphoria all at once. The very characteristic that Purdue had promoted as a built-in safety measure instead became a direct pathway to misuse. From the earliest stages, the company knew this weakness existed, yet that knowledge was deliberately concealed. Soon, accounts of widespread abuse began to emerge, stories of pills sold openly on the street, for $1 per milligram of pharmacies being targeted and robbed, spreading rapidly across the nation. Still, for many years, Purdue shifted responsibility elsewhere. They argued that the issue was not the medication itself, but the criminal behavior of individuals who failed to take it as prescribed. To reinforce this narrative, they introduced and aggressively marketed the idea of pseudo-addiction, a hazardous concept claiming that patients showing classic signs of dependency, such as watching the clock for their next dose or insisting on higher prescriptions, were not truly addicted at all, but were simply victims of inadequately treated pain. According to this logic, the remedy was not caution, but more opioids. As a result, an entirely new population of opioid-dependent individuals was formed not in dark alleys or hidden corners, but within medical offices. These were not the stereotypical drug users. They were high school athletes prescribed OxyContin after a football injury, construction workers receiving it for persistent back pain, suburban mothers given it for chronic migraines. They were people who followed medical advice, who trusted their doctors and the healthcare system. Over time, they developed physical dependence on legally prescribed medication, and then, almost inevitably, that supply was cut off. A physician might grow uneasy and stop renewing prescriptions. A patient might lose health insurance coverage. Meanwhile, the cost of obtaining pills on the black market, where an 80-milligram tablet could sell for $80 quickly, became impossible to sustain. Now, trapped in the grip of a powerful physical addiction, these individuals faced a devastating decision. They could endure the torment of withdrawal, an ordeal many describe as the worst illness imaginable, or they could seek out a cheaper, more readily available substitute to satisfy their dependence. That substitute was waiting for them on the street. It was heroin. The economics were stark and unforgiving. An $80 a day OxyContin habit could be replaced by a $10 or $20 a day heroin habit. Chemically, the two substances are close relatives, activating the same opioid receptors in the brain. For someone dependent on oxycodone, heroin feels nearly indistinguishable. The transition was frighteningly smooth and profoundly destructive. What had once been a prescription pipeline turned into a conveyor belt, carrying hundreds of thousands of Americans from the pharmacy counter to the street corner. The epidemic that the fashion world had briefly glamorized and then rejected in the 90s returned with overwhelming force. But this time, it looked different. It was larger in scale, more widespread, and its victims came from every background. This was not an epidemic driven by cultural fashion, but one born from corporate greed and medical malpractice. It was a national catastrophe delivered one prescription at a time. The so-called miracle drug had misled not just a handful of people, but an entire community of patients and physicians, leaving behind a void that only its older illegal counterpart could fill. High in the thin air of Afghanistan, after the fall of 2001, the world's most powerful military forces arrived with stated noble intentions. Their mission was to dismantle al-Qaeda, remove the Taliban from power, and construct a new nation from the remains of the old. In the immediate period following their arrival, it appeared that progress had been made. The Taliban, in a final and severe assertion of authority in the year 2000, had declared the cultivation of the opium poppy un-Islamic. They enforced this decree with ruthless effectiveness. Fields were destroyed, farmers were punished, and within a single growing season, the global supply of opium dropped by more than 90%. It was an astonishing, though brutal example of supply-side enforcement. For a short time, it seemed as though one of the world's main sources of heroin had simply been shut down. But the new regime, delivered by cruise missiles and special forces, operated under a different set of priorities. The central goal was stability. It was counter-terrorism. And in the intricate web of Afghan tribal politics, stability meant forming alliances. It meant winning hearts and minds. And the hearts and minds of millions of rural Afghans were inseparably tied to the modest, beautiful, and extraordinarily profitable poppy. To eliminate the crop was to destroy the livelihoods of entire regions. It meant creating enemies in places where allies were desperately needed. And so quietly and without public acknowledgement, a decision was made. For the most part, the poppy fields would remain untouched. Coalition commanders fighting an insurgency on the ground understood a simple truth. The farmer whose field you burn today may be the man planting an improvised explosive device for you tomorrow. Warlords, many of whom had become our partners in the struggle against the Taliban, were in fact the same figures who dominated the regional opium trade. Interfering with their operations meant destabilizing the fragile alliances that held the new government together. It was a Faustian deal forged in the dust of Kandahar and the valleys of Helmand province. We chose to ignore the poppy fields, and in return they assisted us in pursuing the Taliban. The irony was unmistakable. The Taliban, regrouping as an insurgent force, recognized the very same opening. The poppy economy proved to be ideal fuel for asymmetric warfare. It demanded no sophisticated infrastructure. It thrived in drought conditions and produced enormous cash flows in a country with little else to offer the global market. The revitalized Taliban began functioning much like a criminal syndicate. They did not need to own or manage every field themselves. What mattered was control of the system. They provided protection to farmers lajos. They imposed taxes on the harvest. They levied fees on traffickers transporting raw opium paste from the fields to the laboratories. They taxed the labs that processed the opium into morphine base, and then into the final highly valued diacetylmorphine. Heroin number 4, At every stage of production, from slicing the poppy pod to loading bricks onto a Toyota Hilux, income was generated. A 10% tax at one point, a 20% tax at another. Together, it accumulated into something immense. The magnitude of the resurgence was staggering. By 2007, only 6 years after the invasion, Afghanistan was responsible for producing 93% of the world's illicit opium. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime reported that opium exports were worth $4 billion annually, an amount equal to more than half of the country's official GDP. Across the south, poppy fields spread like a carpet, waves of fragile white, pink and red blossoms that symbolized deep suffering for the rest of the world. Helmand Province alone yielded more opium than the entire nation of Burma, once the global leader in production. The methods used to move this product were ancient tracing routes as old as the Silk Road. The main corridor became known as the Balkan route. Truck convoys and pack animals carried heroin westward out of Afghanistan and across the porous borders of Iran and Pakistan. From there, shipments were consolidated and funneled through Turkey, a historic hub of smuggling, and onward into the Balkans. In Albania and Kosovo, criminal networks prepared it for final distribution into the lucrative markets of Western Europe. Ton after ton of high-purity, low-cost heroin flooded the continent. Purity levels in cities such as London and Berlin, once stuck in the low double digits, climbed to 40, 50, even 60%. Prices collapsed. A drug that had once been costly and relatively scarce became cheap and widespread. Another route, the Northern Corridor, wound its way into the former Soviet republics of Central Asia, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. From there, it fueled a growing catastrophe within Russia itself, which soon ranked among the countries with the highest per capita rates of heroin addiction worldwide. An immense flow of opiates, originating in the very country the West had occupied to safeguard its own security, now surged outward in every direction, destabilizing societies and financing the very insurgency that foreign troops were sent to defeat. Efforts to halt this trade were Sisyphean. Eradication teams, often made up of Afghan forces supported by American or British troops, would descend on a field. They cut down the stalks and burn the crops. Yet, for every field destroyed, 10 more appeared just beyond the next hill. Programs meant to persuade farmers to adopt alternative crops. Saffron pomegranates were driven by good intentions, but ultimately failed. No legal crop could rival the poppy. A farmer could earn 10 times more from a hectare of opium than from a hectare of wheat, and local buyers would arrive at the farm with cash, often providing seed and fertilizer on credit. The government, by contrast, offered minimal assistance for lawful agriculture. For a man trying to support his family in one of the poorest regions on earth, the decision was hardly a decision at all. The war on terror had, in a very tangible sense, become a conflict financed by narcotics. Money from the poppy fields purchased AK-47's rocket, propelled grenades and night vision goggles for the Taliban. It paid the wages of their fighters. It seeped through and corrupted the new Afghan government from village councils to the highest ministries in Kabul. The very structure of the state we were attempting to build was being eroded by the profits of a flower we had chosen not to eliminate. Afghanistan had turned into the world's first true narco state, a country whose economy and political life were entirely dependent on a single illicit plant. And all of this unfolded under the vigilant gaze of the most advanced military and intelligence machinery ever assembled. A silent, devastating, and entirely foreseeable collapse unfolding openly for all to see. This overwhelming supply of strong, inexpensive heroin produced a worldwide population of users with tolerance levels never seen before. The market became flooded. Those dependent on it were prepared for the next phase, for something more powerful, more affordable, and entirely synthetic. And a dark presence was slowly spreading across North America, a presence that did not originate in poppy fields, but in the cold, clinical reasoning of a chemistry lab. The change did not arrive as a dramatic turning point. It came as a subtle substitution, a chemical takeover carried out in unmarked bags and stained spoons. For years, the narrative of heroin in North America centered on two main sources: black tar heroin from Mexico and white powder heroin, often called China white, that seeped in from Southeast and Southwest Asia. But the drug trade, like any other commercial enterprise, operates according to risk and profit. And manufacturing heroin is a dangerous and inefficient venture. It demands land. It depends on a specific climate. It requires a large compliant workforce to harvest opium gum. The supply chain is lengthy, fragile, and constantly exposed to weather patterns and law enforcement pressure. Then fentanyl entered the picture. It was not a newly invented substance. It had been synthesized back in 1959 by the gifted Belgian chemist Paul Janssen. For many years, it was a respected though extraordinarily potent medical instrument. It served as a powerful anesthetic used in operating rooms and as a painkiller for cancer patients administered through transdermal patches. It was 100 times more potent than morphine, 50 times more potent than pure heroin. A blessing for those suffering intense pain, a monster hidden within the pharmacopoeia. The transformation began when chemists working for criminal organizations recognized the enormous economic advantage of producing fentanyl illegally. It required no farmland, no rural laborers, no growing seasons. All that was needed were the correct precursor chemicals, an experienced chemist, and a laboratory. Those precursors, in most cases, were legally manufactured and easily sourced from the massive, loosely regulated chemical industry in China. Shipped in barrels and falsely labeled as industrial solvents or pigments, they would arrive at ports in Mexico. There, inside superlabs operated by the Sinaloa cartel and the cartel Jalisco New Generation, the synthesis occurred. The reasoning was harsh and indisputable. Producing a kilogram of heroin in Mexico might cost $5,000. That same kilogram could be sold wholesale in the United States for perhaps $80,000, an extraordinary profit margin. But a kilogram of pure fentanyl, which could be manufactured for even less, was so powerful that it could be transformed into the equivalent of 50 kilograms of street-level product. The potential profit was not merely higher, it was exponentially, astronomically greater. A single kilogram of fentanyl contained enough lethal doses to kill 500,000 people. The dangers of smuggling also dropped sharply. Instead of transporting heavy bricks of heroin across the border, Traffickers could now move an equally profitable substance in a package no larger than a small bag of sugar. At first, fentanyl was used as a cutting agent, a booster. Dealers blended small amounts into their heroin supply to enhance its strength and extend their inventory. A user accustomed to a specific dose of heroin would inject what they believed was their usual amount. But the bag was hot. It contained fentanyl, and the outcome was disastrous. A few extra micrograms, an amount invisible to the naked eye. Just a few grains of salt's worth made the difference between a familiar euphoric rush and immediate respiratory depression. The user would feel a brief warmth and then nothing. Breathing would slow, become shallow, and then stop altogether. Overdose figures began rising at a pace that shocked public health officials. What had once been a chronic, simmering crisis turned into an acute, explosive catastrophe. In 2013, in the United States, there were just over 8,000 deaths from heroin overdose and a little over 3,000 from synthetic opioids like fentanyl. By 2017, heroin-related deaths had doubled to more than 16,000, while deaths from synthetic opioids had surged nearly tenfold to almost 30,000. By 2021, that number would surpass 70,000. It was a quiet, unyielding form of chemical warfare being carried out on the streets of America. It was not a matter of choice for users. The market simply shifted beneath them. The substance they were seeking, the familiar brown or white powder, was no longer what it claimed to be. It became a Trojan horse. Heroin turned into the delivery mechanism for fentanyl. Soon the cartels realized they no longer needed heroin at all. They could compress fentanyl into pills, carefully imitating prescription opioids like OxyContin or Xanax. A teenager purchasing a single pill from a friend or through social media, believing they were experimenting with a pharmaceutical, was in reality taking a dose of illicit fentanyl capable of stopping their heart. The situation grew even more ominous with the rise of fentanyl analogues. These were slightly altered chemical relatives of fentanyl, often produced by chemists to bypass specific chemical bans. Substances such as acetyl fentanyl, furanol fentanyl, and the most frightening of all, carfentanil. Carfentanil is an elephant tranquilizer. It is 10,000 times more potent than morphine and 100 times more powerful than fentanyl itself. A single microgram, a particle barely visible to the eye, could be fatal. When carfentanil began infiltrating the street drug supply, even the most experienced users were terrified. Overdoses became nearly instantaneous and extraordinarily hard to reverse. First responders, including paramedics, firefighters, and police officers, found themselves on the front lines of this new epidemic. They would arrive at scenes marked by an eerie stillness. A man collapsed over the steering wheel of his car at a green light. A young couple lying lifeless in the bathroom of a gas station. A group of friends, all dead in the same room after sharing a single contaminated batch. These scenes replayed day after day in small towns and major cities alike, stretching from the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt. Morgues overflowed. Coroners fell behind. The magnitude of the death toll was hard to grasp because it was so silent, so private, unfolding behind closed doors. It was not one dramatic catastrophe, but countless small, isolated tragedies accumulating into a national trauma. The shadow of fentanyl had completely overtaken the old world of heroin. The poppy fields of Afghanistan and Mexico, long seen as the source of the crisis, had become almost secondary. The threat was no longer agricultural. It was industrial. It was synthesized in laboratories, moved with the efficiency of a multinational corporation, and distributed with lethal indifference. The so-called miracle drug had always been deceptive, but its final synthetic evolution proved to be its most treacherous and deadly illusion, leaving behind a legacy of devastation so profound that the world is still struggling to even measure its depth, let alone begin the work of recovery. The burden of this history is not measured in tons of seized narcotics or billions of dollars in profit, but in absence. An empty seat at the dinner table, a child's bedroom left untouched for years, a voice preserved on an old voicemail that will never be heard again. The legacy of heroin, and now fentanyl, is a narrative of subtraction of lives, ended early and futures erased. The scale of the loss is overwhelming, a slow-motion catastrophe that has hollowed out communities and carved scars across generations. Behind every overdose statistic lies a vast web of grief, a family torn apart, a circle of friends left asking what they might have done differently. And yet, amid this immense darkness, a quiet and resolute response has begun to take shape. It is a response driven not by moral judgment, but by pragmatism and a desperate determination to keep people alive. This approach is known as harm reduction. If, in the short term, people cannot be stopped from using a dangerous substance, steps can still be taken to lessen the immediate harm it causes. It is an implicit acknowledgement that the war on drugs, with its emphasis on punishment and supply disruption, has failed to protect the most vulnerable. The most powerful tool in this emerging arsenal is a medication called naloxone, more commonly known by its brand name, Narcan. It is essentially an antidote. An opioid overdose occurs because drug molecules attach to receptors in the brainstem that regulate breathing. The drug quietly instructs the body to stop breathing. Naloxone works through brute force. It binds more strongly to those opioid receptors than heroin or fentanyl does. When administered most often as a nasal spray, it forcibly dislodges the opioid molecules from the receptors and takes their place, blocking their effects. The results can be astonishingly rapid and dramatic. A person who is blue, not breathing, and seconds from death can be jolted back to consciousness in less than a minute, gasping for air as if breaking the surface after being submerged. For decades, naloxone was used only by paramedics and emergency room physicians. But as the fentanyl crisis intensified, a movement emerged to place this life-saving drug into the hands of the public. Police officers began carrying it, librarians were trained to administer it, and most crucially, it was distributed directly to people who use drugs and to their families. The individual most likely to witness an overdose is another person who uses drugs. Giving them the ability to save a friend's life may be the clearest expression of harm reduction. It is a simple chemical intervention that declares that a life is worth saving in that moment, regardless of the choices that led there. Another central pillar of this practical strategy is the creation of supervised consumption sites, also known as safe injection sites. The idea is straightforward and, for some, deeply controversial. It offers a hygienic, secure, and carefully supervised environment where individuals can use illicit substances they have already obtained under the watch of trained medical professionals. Participants receive sterile injection supplies, which significantly lowers the spread of HIV and hepatitis C. And in the event of an overdose, which does sometimes occur, nurses are immediately present with oxygen and naloxone ready to act without delay. No person has ever died from an overdose in an officially sanctioned, supervised consumption site anywhere on the planet. The longest running of these facilities, InSite in Vancouver, Canada, has reversed thousands of overdoses since it first opened its doors in 2003. These facilities are not designed to cure addiction itself. They exist to prevent death. They function as a bridge, a vital point of connection where someone caught in the disorder of addiction can meet healthcare providers, social workers, and pathways toward treatment. For many, this may be the first genuine doorway out of the alleyway. Beyond these urgent, life-preserving measures stretches the long and demanding path of recovery, and here as well, science has introduced renewed hope. For a large number of people, the most effective route forward is medication-assisted treatment, or MAT. This approach uses long-acting opioids such as methadone or buprenorphine to address the physical dimensions of addiction. This is not merely replacing one substance with another. Methadone in use since the 1960s, and the newer buprenorphine frequently paired with naloxone in a formulation known as Suboxone. Work by binding to the same brain receptors targeted by heroin. However, they do so gradually and over an extended period. They do not generate an intense euphoric surge. Instead, they relieve the severe agonizing symptoms of withdrawal and calm the relentless, overpowering cravings that so often trigger relapse. By bringing stability to the brain's chemistry, these medications offer individuals the opportunity to rebuild their lives. They can maintain employment. They can mend damaged relationships. They can participate in therapy and counseling to confront the trauma or mental health challenges that may have contributed to their substance use in the first place. MAT creates a foundation of stability from which the deeper psychological work of recovery can begin. And yet, despite its well-documented success, access remains a major obstacle. There are too few clinics, too few physicians willing to prescribe these treatments, and a deeply rooted stigma continues to persist. The belief that real recovery must mean total abstinence, that using medication is a weakness or an easy way out. This is a moral judgment that has no place in medicine, a bias that costs lives. The history of heroin is a narrative shaped by deception, a medical miracle that became an instrument of social control, a source of funding for revolutionaries, and a manufactured scourge for a new century. It has produced a legacy of devastation that will take generations to repair. The struggle against it is no longer a straightforward war to be won, but a complex, chronic condition to be managed. This struggle is being carried forward not only by law enforcement and border officials, but by researchers in laboratories, by social workers in community clinics, by parents who keep Narcan in their bags, and by individuals who day after day make the quiet, brave decision to fight for their own recovery. There is no final triumph in this story, no simple conclusion to the long night. There is only the slow, demanding labor of repairing the harm, of saving lives one by one, of attempting to draw a measure of light back into the vast shadow cast by the poppy and the laboratory. The miracle that once misled the world has delivered a harsh lesson that some miracles carry a cost far too great to accept, and that the steady, uncelebrated work of healing may be the only true miracle that remains. Most people believe they already understand what meth is. They've seen the arrest photos, heard the frightening tales, watched Breaking Bad, and come away thinking it's simply a mix of science, chemistry, and crime. They recognize the cliches, the shaking hands, the constant scratching, the damaged teeth. It becomes something easy to mock, easy to dismiss, easy to turn into a joke. But meth is not a meme. It isn't a punchline meant for laughter. It stands as one of the most devastating drugs on the planet. Not because it ends your life right away, but because it keeps you alive. Just long enough to dismantle everything you care about. It doesn't lull you into sleep, and it doesn't slow your body or mind. Instead, it forces you to stay alert, awake, and tightly wound until your brain finally breaks under the strain. This is not a substance that quietly creeps up on you. It makes its damage visible at every single stage. And the cruelest reality is that once it enters your body, you won't want it to stop. This is the true story of methamphetamine, what it actually is, where it originated, how it reshapes the brain, and why people continue to use it, even when they fully understand that it will ultimately destroy them. Methamphetamine is a powerful stimulant of the central nervous system that functions by overwhelming the brain with an enormous unnatural flood of neurotransmitters, including dopamine and serotonin. Structurally, it closely resembles amphetamine, yet it is far stronger, far more addictive, and significantly more damaging to brain tissue. On paper, it may appear to be just another lab-created stimulant. In real-world use, however, it stands as one of the most devastating drugs ever produced. From a chemical standpoint, meth is part of the amphetamine family, but the intensity of its effects goes far beyond related substances. The distinction between methamphetamine and medications, such as Adderall, which contains mixed amphetamine salts, is not simply a matter of dose. Meth crosses the blood-brain barrier with far greater efficiency and remains active for much longer periods. It doesn't merely stimulate the brain, it takes control of it. While Adderall typically lasts 4 to 6 hours, the effects of meth can extend up to 12 hours. And that duration only reflects the main high. The residual effects, including anxiety, insomnia, and restlessness, can persist for days afterward. This is not a brief alteration of brain chemistry. It is a prolonged neurological takeover. There is a legal pharmaceutical form of methamphetamine known as desoxin, which is approved in very rare cases for ADHD or severe obesity. However, it is almost never prescribed because of its extreme abuse potential and the heavy stigma surrounding it. Desoxin is produced as a small, tightly controlled tablet. By contrast, crystal meth, the illicit street version, is a crudely manufactured, extremely potent crystalline substance that is commonly smoked, snorted, injected, or swallowed. It is often produced in makeshift laboratories using over-the-counter ingredients such as pseudoephedrine, lithium, and anhydrous ammonia, a chemical also used in fertilizers and industrial cleaners. The end product is an unstable compound frequently contaminated with solvents and heavy metals. Once ingested, meth causes a massive release of dopamine in the brain's reward centers, far exceeding what the brain is designed to tolerate. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter linked to pleasure motivation and goal-directed behavior. Under normal circumstances, it reinforces habits and rewards behaviors necessary for survival. With meth, dopamine levels can surge to 10 times the normal amount or more. The user may feel unstoppable, powerful, intensely focused, and euphoric. Every action feels urgent. Every thought feels inspired. Sleep seems unnecessary. Hunger disappears. For a short period, it can feel as though a new level of human capability has been unlocked. But that sensation is temporary. As meth use continues, the drug rapidly drains the brain's natural dopamine reserves and damages the neurons responsible for producing it. Over time, this results in a collapse of the brain's reward system. Former users often describe an inability to experience motivation, pleasure, or even mild interest in everyday tasks without the drug. This is one of meth's most dangerous characteristics. It doesn't simply create a high, it redefines what the brain interprets as normal. Different methods of use lead to different timelines and intensities of effect. Smoking meth produces the quickest and most intense high, often within seconds, delivering a powerful full-body rush. Snorting is slower and less efficient, though still highly potent. Injecting meth bypasses the body's metabolic filters entirely, causing an immediate and overwhelming spike in euphoria, while also carrying the highest risk of overdose and infection. Swallowing meth results in a longer-lasting but less intense experience and is less common for recreational use. Regardless of the method, the initial effects are similar: heightened alertness, surging energy extreme, focus, suppressed appetite, and a strong sense of control or purpose. As the dosage increases, those effects often evolve into something far more disturbing. Users may become agitated, paranoid, or hypersexual. Thoughts begin looping endlessly. Movements turn repetitive. Some individuals develop compulsive behaviors or rituals such as excessive cleaning, obsessive organizing, skin picking, or constant pacing. These are not merely side effects, they are woven into the experience itself. The half-life of meth is especially punishing. While many substances wear off within a few hours, meth can remain active in the bloodstream for 8 to 12 hours or longer. Even after the euphoric phase fades, the user is often left overstimulated, jittery, and emotionally unstable. When the crash arrives, it is sudden and severe. Dopamine levels plummet without mercy. Users commonly feel anxious, exhausted, depressed, and profoundly emotionally numb. Sleep becomes nearly impossible, even as the body desperately needs it. Appetite may return intensely, yet digestion is frequently disrupted. The user can feel both overstimulated and empty. At the same time, a condition that drives many to take more of the drug simply to feel capable of functioning. Methamphetamine does not fade gently. It does not wear off the way alcohol or cannabis might. It collapses like an overloaded system, and with each crash, something essential is lost. Over time, chronic use erodes the brain's ability to regulate emotion, impulse control, and attention, leaving lasting damage that can persist long after the drug itself is gone. Not only during intoxication, but overall and over time. Neuroimaging of long-term users reveals a reduction in grey matter, particularly within the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for judgment, impulse control, and self-awareness. The harm caused is not limited to chemistry alone. It alters the brain's physical structure. What makes meth uniquely dangerous is that prolonged use is not required for these changes to begin. Even sporadic binges remaining awake for multiple days, repeatedly dosing to delay the crash, can provoke psychosis, deep paranoia, and even hallucinations. Some individuals start reporting shadow figures after only a few cycles of use, and these experiences are not hallucinations in the psychedelic sense. They represent complete ruptures from reality. Beliefs of being hunted, sensations of insects crawling beneath the skin, fears of constant government monitoring, and the conviction that friends have become enemies. Meth doesn't merely intensify fear, it shapes it into something tangible. Despite all of this, meth continues to be widely used. In rural areas, it is often the least expensive and most readily available stimulant. In cities, it is frequently mixed into party drugs or combined with opioids. Among manual laborers, it is viewed as a productivity aid, something used to endure long shifts or cope with homelessness. Its attraction is not about escape, it is about function. Meth does not carry users to another reality. It convinces them they can manage this one until it ultimately erases their capacity to exist within it. Methamphetamine did not originate on the streets. It originated in a laboratory. The earliest documented synthesis of methamphetamine occurred in 1919 in Japan, carried out by a chemist working with ephedrine, a naturally occurring stimulant derived from the ma huang plant. Ephedrine had already been used in traditional medicine to increase energy and ease bronchial conditions, but researchers were searching for something stronger, more stable, and more concentrated. The result was methamphetamine hydrochloride. Colorless, crystalline, and extraordinarily potent. In its early days, it was regarded as a medical innovation. Doctors prescribed it for narcolepsy, depression, exhaustion, and even asthma. Its most significant impact, however, emerged during wartime. When World War II began, methamphetamine became a tool of war. Tablets were distributed to Nazi soldiers to help them march longer, fight harder, and remain awake for days. Entire military units were sustained by it. These pills became known as Stuka pills, named after the Luftwaffe's dive bombers. Pervitin was not merely allowed, it was actively promoted with official military documents praising its capacity to enhance morale and aggression. Adolf Hitler himself reportedly received frequent methamphetamine injections during the final years of the war, administered by his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell. Japan followed a similar path. Meth was given to kamikaze pilots before suicide missions believed to dull fear and sharpen focus in the final moments before death. In the United States, amphetamines were also widely issued during the war most commonly in the form of benzedrine, a milder relative of meth. When the war ended, meth quickly found a new role back home. Pharmaceutical companies began selling it to civilians, targeting housewives, students and laborers. Marketed under names such as methadone and Obitrol, it was advertised as a weight loss aid, a mood enhancer and an energy booster. For a time, it was everywhere. Prescribed legally, easily, refilled and framed as a symbol of American efficiency and productivity. During the 1950s and 60s, meth use became particularly common among truck drivers and night shift workers. People who needed to stay awake, alert, and active for extended periods. Entire occupations quietly integrated meth into daily routines, and the pills were broadly accepted as part of working-class life. Yet, beneath the surface, the drug's destructive consequences were becoming increasingly apparent. As understanding of addiction and misuse spread, government authorities began imposing tighter controls. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, outlaw motorcycle gangs, such as the Hells Angels, began manufacturing meth themselves, relying on over-the-counter products and improvised chemistry. These were not refined operations. They were makeshift labs in garages, barns, trailers, and farmhouses using crude equipment and stolen chemicals. This period marked meth's transition from a pharmaceutical substance to a criminal commodity. It ceased being something obtained from a pharmacy and became something purchased from someone carrying a burner phone and wearing a gas mask. The homemade versions were less pure, more unstable, and often contaminated with toxic byproducts. But they were inexpensive, powerful, and easy to distribute. Motorcycle gangs controlled meth trafficking for years, particularly along the West Coast, in regions like California's Central Valley. Meth labs appeared with alarming frequency. Underground chemists developed new formulas, higher yields, and purer results. And each time authorities shut down one method, another replaced it. Meth production evolved into a constant contest between chemistry and law enforcement, but demand never truly declined. In rural parts of America, meth became a means of enduring poverty. In urban centers, it served as a way to push through longer shifts or remain awake all night. In both settings, however, the damage was becoming impossible to ignore. People weren't simply getting high, they were falling apart mentally and socially. And unlike heroin or cocaine, meth offered no built-in pause. It didn't knock users unconscious. Instead, it kept them awake long enough to ruin everything around them. By the 1980s, the US meth crisis was fully in motion. What had begun as a laboratory experiment in Japan then became a pill for soldiers. Later, a prescription for housewives had transformed into something far more sinister, something wild. Meth was no longer a medical substance. It had become a form of chemical rebellion. An outlaw drug cooked in sheds and trailers passed through small towns and consumed by people who simply needed to keep going. Meth is not only an American problem. It is a global drug that takes on different forms depending on where it appears. In Southeast Asia, the most common version is known as shabu, typically crystalline meth, smoked through small glass pipes. In the Philippines, shabu has been deeply embedded since the 1980s, spreading through urban poverty in densely packed neighborhoods where it became a way to stay awake, work longer hours, or dull hunger. Its widespread use was one of the main justifications behind Rodrigo Duterte's violent war on drugs, a campaign that has killed thousands of users and small-time dealers, yet has done little to reduce the flow of shabu itself. In countries such as Thailand and Myanmar, meth is often manufactured in enormous jungle laboratories run by organized crime groups like the United Wasp State Army, then moved across borders, hidden inside trucks or boats. There's more detail on that topic if you want to explore it further in my drug smuggling methods iceberg. In these regions, meth use is less about partying and more about survival, and labor acting as a cheap, long-lasting stimulant in economies where exhaustion is a daily condition. In Australia and New Zealand, meth, commonly referred to as ice, is closely tied to outlaw motorcycle gangs, reflecting its earlier association with American biker groups. These organizations manage distribution networks, transporting meth from Asian suppliers into domestic markets. Australia ranks among the countries with the highest meth prices in the world due to strict border enforcement, but that has not reduced demand. The drug's massive profit margins make it a cornerstone of organized crime, and its spread has placed severe strain on emergency health services, which increasingly deal with cases of meth-induced psychosis that escalate into violence in hospitals and police custody. In these societies, meth is strongly linked to both nightlife culture and working-class communities, bridging the divide between recreational use and functional dependence. Perhaps the most unusual account comes from North Korea, where meth is reportedly produced not only by criminals, but at times by the state itself. Since at least the 1990s, during the country's economic collapse, meth has been manufactured for domestic use as well as for export. Reports indicate that for years it was so widespread inside the country that it was used socially and even given as a type of gift during visits. Beyond its borders, smuggling networks have moved North Korean meth into China, and farther afield, turning it into an unofficial economic lifeline. While the full scale is impossible to confirm, defectors and intelligence agencies describe meth as one of the regime's most dependable underground exports, a drug that doubles as a survival mechanism for a government under heavy sanctions. What connects all of these regions is the way meth adapts to the needs of the society around it. In impoverished communities, it becomes a tool for work and endurance. In wealthier but high-pressure societies, it turns into a performance enhancer and social lubricant. Within criminal economies, it functions as a highly valuable commodity. Unlike heroin or cocaine, which rely on specific crops and geographic regions, meth is synthetic. It can be produced anywhere there is access to chemical precursors and basic equipment. That quality makes it both adaptable and resilient, a substance that reshapes itself to fit its surroundings, thriving in conditions of instability, poverty, and desperation. Meth rarely causes death through overdose, in the same way opioids do. Instead, most meth-related emergencies are behavioral rather than strictly medical. Hospitals frequently receive patients not because they have stopped breathing, but because they are experiencing a violent psychotic episode. Emergency room staff are often overwhelmed by individuals who arrive severely dehydrated, paranoid, aggressive, or completely incoherent. These cases are not quick to resolve. They can require hours of restraint, sedation, and close observation. And unlike a single-dose overdose, meth-induced psychosis can continue long after the drug itself has cleared the bloodstream. Sometimes it requires days of sustained observation and policing. Meth-related incidents is just as exhausting. When someone is tweaking, it often takes several officers simply to control the situation. Meth can give users a powerful rush of adrenaline and physical endurance, making restraint difficult and dangerous for everyone involved. Many police departments describe meth calls as some of the most resource-intensive emergencies they respond to, not because of fatalities, but because of the disorder the drug unleashes in public spaces. These incidents can stretch on for hours, demanding negotiation, physical restraint, or even SWAT-style interventions when paranoia escalates into barricades or the use of weapons. The psychiatric system is also placed under enormous pressure by meth use. Many people who experience public breakdowns end up in jail cells rather than treatment facilities. Law enforcement becomes the first point of healthcare, with individuals cycling through short psychiatric holds. Incarceration and release only to be sent back into the same environments that fuel their use. Without long-term meth recovery, the revolving door continues. Instead of being defined by overdoses, America's meth crisis shows itself in emergency rooms, police logs, and overcrowded jails. Institutions are forced to manage mental health collapses rather than direct policing of overdoses. When most people think of meth today, they don't imagine a rural trap house or a burned-out motel bathroom. They picture a man in a hazmat suit, a science teacher, a brilliant mind with nothing left to lose, cooking pure blue crystals in a state-of-the-art lab. They picture Walter White. When Breaking Bad premiered in 2008, it didn't just become one of the most critically acclaimed television series of all time. It reshaped how an entire generation understood meth. It took a chaotic, often grotesque reality and turned it into a story about power logic and control. For millions of viewers, it became their only reference point for how meth is produced, distributed, and used. The show's central hook was ingenious. Take a quiet, overlooked man and give him a reason to push back. Not through brute force, but through chemistry. Walt doesn't simply sell meth. He creates it, refining it to an almost mythical standard. Crystal blue persuasion, a pure 99% product treated like something precious. The series fixated on the process, Berners glassware reagents transforming meth production into something meticulous, even beautiful. For the audience, this wasn't about getting high, it was about bringing order to chaos through science. It was an empire. But that portrayal of the meth world, while technically accurate in certain details, is deeply incomplete. The real meth scene doesn't resemble a superlab. It looks like a shed behind a trailer park, or a storage unit packed with bleach and battery acid. There is no purity standard. The average cook isn't a trained chemist, but someone who learned from a friend, bought stolen pseudoephedrine, and mixed everything together in a stolen crockpot. In Breaking Bad, meth is treated like a character powerful, pure and clean. In reality, meth is a street drug diluted with poison and sold simply to survive. Walt never smokes it. Jesse eventually stops using it. Most of the people who do use it are shown as villains or victims, never as central figures. The story focuses on what meth does to an industry, not what it does to a human body. That isn't a mistake, it's a deliberate choice, but it also means the show, for all its brilliance, never truly shows what meth feels like. There is no tweaking in Breaking Bad, no psychosis, no picking at skin until it bleeds, no hearing voices or seeing shadows moving in the corner of a room. The few moments when meth's effects appear are only when they serve the plot. Otherwise, the drug remains symbolic. In reality, meth's high is immediate and overwhelming. Within seconds of smoking or injecting it, and within minutes if it is snorted or swallowed, the brain is flooded with dopamine at levels hundreds of times higher than it could ever generate naturally. That surge doesn't just feel good, it feels like the best moment of your life compressed into a single violent rush. Confidence explodes, insecurities vanish, and energy seems endless. For some users, hypersexuality arrives first, an intense and obsessive fixation on touch and stimulation. For others, it manifests as pure productivity, a feeling that they can think faster, speak faster, and accomplish more than anyone around them. In those early hours, sleep and hunger disappear entirely. Time slips by unnoticed, small problems feel manageable, social anxiety melts away, and the body feels light, quick, and sharp. But meth's half-life can stretch to 12 hours or more, and the intensity doesn't ease gradually. It keeps pushing until the body begins to unravel. Jaws lock, tight muscles stiffen, and the skin develops a crawling sensation that can't be scratched away. The anxiety that vanished earlier flips into paranoia. The same heightened senses that once made colors brighter and sounds clearer now turn shadows into threats, and silence into something menacing. By the crash, users are often trapped in compulsive behaviors, pacing back and forth, organizing and reorganizing items, dismantling objects only to put them together again, or repeatedly picking at the skin until it breaks and bleeds. After prolonged binges, hallucinations are common. Sometimes they appear as shadowy figures. Sometimes they manifest as imaginary insects crawling beneath the skin. Sometimes it's simply the unshakable belief that someone is watching from outside. Sleep becomes unreachable, even when the body is completely exhausted. With continued long-term use, these symptoms begin to appear even during the high itself. The early phase that once felt energized and creative grows shorter and shorter. It is quickly replaced by twitching repetitive movements and looping thoughts. The substance stops feeling like a boost and starts feeling like an obligation, a chemical command that forces the brain to continue long after the body should have stopped. Methamphetamine devastates the body in ways that can become noticeable within months and irreversible within years. The well-known condition called meth mouth results from a combination of severe dry mouth, constant teeth grinding, and the acidic nature of the smoke itself. Under normal conditions, saliva protects tooth enamel. Meth's chemical effects suppress saliva production, leaving teeth exposed while users clench their jaws during binges and neglect basic hygiene. As a result, teeth can decay all the way down to the gum line in just a matter of months. Skin damage is another defining sign. Long-term users frequently experience formication, the sensation of insects moving under the skin, which leads to relentless scratching and picking. Even when that hallucination is absent, meth causes minor skin flaws to feel intolerable, triggering obsessive grooming behaviors that turn small blemishes into open wounds. Combined with poor blood circulation and a weakened immune system, these injuries heal slowly and scar easily, leaving the skin pitted and unhealthy in appearance. The drug also dramatically accelerates physical aging. Meth induces intense oxidative stress and cellular damage, breaking down collagen and elastin in the skin, reducing muscle mass and harming tiny blood vessels. Someone in their late 20s can begin to look decades older after only a few years of heavy use. Inside the brain, the damage is even more severe. Grey matter in regions responsible for memory decision-making and emotional regulation is reduced. Long-term users may develop lasting psychosis hallucinations, delusions, and paranoia that do not fully disappear even after stopping use. The stimulant's constant overstimulation of dopamine systems is linked to permanent changes in brain chemistry that resemble schizophrenia, turning recovery into a lifelong process rather than a simple detox. Meth use patterns further intensify this destruction. Many users remain awake for 3 to 10 days straight, pushing their bodies into extreme sleep deprivation, malnutrition, and dehydration, before finally collapsing. The crash that follows can last for days, characterized by profound depression, physical pain, and an inability to experience pleasure without the drug. Meth does not merely wear someone down, it reshapes them. Neural pathways gradually shift toward compulsive seeking and repeated use, while the areas of the brain responsible for judgment and self-control weaken. Over time, the drug stops being something taken to get high and becomes the baseline state the body depends on making every moment. Without it feel like complete disintegration. Meth addiction functions differently from opioid addiction, but it is no less destructive. The body does not enter the same violent physical withdrawal seen with heroin, yet meth creates a neurological dependency that is extraordinarily difficult to overcome. When meth floods the brain, it releases massive amounts of dopamine as discussed earlier. This overstimulation not only produces an intense high, but also forces the brain to adapt by reducing its own dopamine production and destroying some dopamine transporters in the process. As a result, even after the drug wears off, the brain struggles to regulate mood, motivation, and reward. When the high ends, the dopamine crash hits hard. Many users describe it as an emotional emptiness marked by depression, irritability, and in many cases, suicidal thoughts. It is not simply fatigue or sadness. The brain's reward system is so depleted that even basic actions like eating or speaking feel completely pointless. This is a major reason relapse rates with meth are so high. Being sober is not just normal, it feels actively worse than normal for a long period after quitting. Cravings are among the most persistent elements of meth addiction. They can be triggered by stress, boredom, sexual arousal, specific social settings, or anything linked to past use. The brain forms powerful learned connections between meth and pleasure or excitement. Because the drug overwhelms the brain so intensely, these memory associations become deeply embedded. Even years later, a single trigger can provoke overwhelming urges to use again. Another critical factor is the shift in personal identity. Meth does not only produce a high, it can create the feeling of having unlocked a stronger, more capable version of oneself. Early on, many users report increased productivity, sharper concentration, and a heightened sense of confidence. The substance is often linked to confidence in social situations, sexual ability, or bursts of creativity. As time passes, individuals start to believe that without it, they are less intelligent, less engaging, or less desirable, and everyday life begins to feel dull and insufficient without that chemical push. Withdrawing from meth is brutal, but in a very different way, compared to coming off depressants or opioids. There is usually no dramatic vomiting, sweating, or seizures. Instead, people face crushing exhaustion, trouble sleeping, paranoia, anxiety, and a deeply disturbing condition called anhedonia, defined as a total inability to feel pleasure. This emotional numbness can persist for weeks and sometimes for months, particularly among long-term heavy users. Throughout this phase, the brain is gradually attempting to restore dopamine function and mend damaged neural pathways. Sleep cycles are often severely disrupted, with some individuals experiencing intense nightmares or hypersomnia, followed later by insomnia. The risk of relapse is at its peak during this early stage of recovery, because life without meth feels unbearably slow and muted, compared to the chemically overstimulated state the brain had adapted to. Without strong support networks and effective coping tools, many return to using simply to escape the overwhelming emptiness. This pattern of massive dopamine surges followed by profound depletion is what keeps people trapped. Even when they fully understand the harm meth causes, the memory of how it once made them feel can overpower all rational thinking. Meth today is not the same drug associated with the 90s rave culture or the era of biker labs. It has evolved into something far darker. Across much of the US, it is no longer seen as a party drug. It has become a drug of poverty, of relentless labor, of trauma. It appears in communities where people who are stuck in exhausting, low-paying jobs or struggling to survive without reliable health care. Sex workers use it to stay awake and continue working through the night. Manual laborers rely on it to push through punishing shifts without rest. Students, particularly those in underfunded schools or juggling multiple jobs, sometimes turn to it to cram through overnight study sessions. Among homeless populations, meth's long-lasting high provides both a sense of warmth in cold conditions and the ability to remain alert in dangerous environments. It is becoming increasingly entrenched in rural America, where in many places it is replacing opioids. In towns devastated by pill mill shutdowns and the fentanyl crisis, meth fills the void. It is inexpensive, widely available, and lasts far longer than heroin. Dealers rarely need to persuade users to switch. Economics and accessibility make the decision for them. In many regions, meth is no longer locally produced biker meth. The supply chain has shifted toward ultra-pure industrial-grade meth, manufactured in Mexican super labs, flooding the market with substances far more potent than what users were smoking or snorting 20 years ago. The intersection of meth and opioids is where fatalities have begun to surge. Goofballs combinations of meth with heroin or fentanyl are now extremely common, sometimes used intentionally to chase both stimulation from meth and sedation from opioids. In other cases, fentanyl is mixed into meth without any warning, meaning individuals with no opioid tolerance can suffer fatal overdoses after a single use. This combination also makes quitting far more difficult. The body becomes dependent on both classes of drugs, each with its own painful withdrawal process. Law enforcement and emergency responders are no longer dealing solely with overdoses. They are confronting meth-induced psychosis on a massive scale. In many cities, the majority of meth-related 911 calls are not about unconscious individuals. They involve people running into traffic stripping in public, smashing windows, or barricading themselves inside buildings during intense paranoid episodes. These are not brief or isolated breakdowns. Meth psychosis can last for days even after the substance has left the body, and can progress into long-term schizophrenia-like conditions. For police officers, EMTs and hospital staff, this results in more violent encounters, more psychiatric detentions, and increased strain on systems that are already overwhelmed. This is the modern reality of meth. It is not glamorous, not clean, and not clever. It is a drug deeply embedded in cycles of exhaustion, poverty, and survival, and the destruction it leaves behind is not confined to bodies or minds, but spreads through entire neighborhoods forced to adapt to its presence.